just to test this. So now I'm going to just go into YouTube real quick and see if it's started making sounds.
No, I don't hear anything. I'm not getting any double feedback, so I don't even make it broadcast.
It's working now. Started making sound.
Yeah, now it is.
Yep. All right. So we're good. We're starting a little bit early, but that's okay. We're just gonna, maybe we can, play some music or something. No, just kidding.
Okay.
And so.
Well, we should wait at least 3 minutes to give people time to come over here.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. Okay, why is it not working yet? That's weird. Hold on.
No, it is. Okay, so we're live a little early. I see the typing.
Oh, okay. So you see it. I don't know why I don't.
Refresh your page.
I'll refresh it, yeah, and then. All right, hold on. All right, there we go. Alrighty, that's good. So we got this. Okay, so let me close the studio then, and all right, and yep. So we're just working through any technical.
Yeah, just a point. There are a few questions people did send me to answer.
Okay, great.
And I don't really. I mean, some of them are extremely. Let's
just read them and see what.
Some of them I'm not going. Some of them I want to answer when I return in the next few weeks. So I don't really want to answer them right now.
Oh yeah, for those who don't know, Father Enoch is going on church business for a couple weeks, so I will have to either find a temporary co-host or go it alone. But this will continue while we're doing that, and of course we'll talk about that. But
well, it's just us here right now. There's no one else actually showing up. So.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, you have to remember also people do watch this afterwards.
Oh, okay.
Something to keep in mind.
Maybe we should think about getting like a introduction music type thing.
Well, like that Maple Story stuff that I use on the other ones.
Maple Story? What's that mean? Oh, well, no. Something maybe like chant music or something. It's like that fades in and then it fades out,
Okay.
Something we can, that's stuff to make it more, I guess, professional. I guess, I've only made a few videos, so I'm not a big expert on the YouTube stuff.
But, we're here for the apologetics, not for amazing YouTube.
Yeah, but I guess you can make it somewhat entertaining, I suppose.
I think we're entertaining. All right. Anyway, that's okay. That's not the point.
Got a minute left. Okay. So I have one question I'm going to answer in about a minute. It's basically someone asked a question about my sources when I said last program that oh, here we are.
Okay, we're live. Yep, we found it. Okay, well, this is Deacon Joseph Sweden, and I'm here with Arma Enoch.
Hello.
Yes, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay. All right. So let's get started. You said you found a question about sources or something.
On the last week on the broadcast, I made a statement saying that it was not the teaching of the Orthodox Church that unbaptized infants go to hell. And someone sent me a question saying, what were my sources for that? And I actually wrote an article about, it must have been 2-3 years ago. No, it wasn't. It was only 2017, I guess.
Okay, well, that's here.
And anyway, I think the best source is to quote the Lenten Triodion for Meat Fair Saturday. And the Lenten Triodion for Meat Fair Saturday, the reading from the Synaxarion, I guess Triodion Synaxarion reading says, we should also know that when baptized infants die, that is ones who have been baptized, they enjoy the paradise of delight, whereas those not illumined by baptism, that is infants not illumined by baptism, and those born of pagans go neither to paradise nor to Gehenna. When the soul departs from the body, it has no concern for the things of this world, but only for the things of the heavenly realm. And I'll post this article in the links. I forgot to send the other links for last week's description. I'll try to do that tomorrow. So as far as I can tell, the teaching of the church, if you take the Synaxarion reading to be in any way authoritative, it does teach that unbaptized infants do not go to Gehenna, which is what we would commonly call hell, punishment. So that's my source. And also, Patriarch. There was another statement made by. Let me see here. Yes. Okay. So by Patriarch Saint Kirill the Sixth, who died in 1818, he was actually killed by the Turks. Was one of the new martyrs under the Turkish yoke. He made the statement that unbaptized infants do not go to hell to purify some willfully committed sin, nor do they deserve to go to the heavenly kingdom, since they were not purged of the pollution of ancestral sin by the divine bath, nor have they the chance for spiritual rebirth. So, and that's quoted by Androstos, who was a Greek writer of the 19th century. And there are several other quotes. There's the famous one where St. Ambrose of Milan says in his book on Abraham, and book 2, chapter 11, section 84, St. Ambrose says, "Unless one be born again of water and the Holy Ghost, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. He accepts no one, neither the infant nor one hindered by unavoidable accident. These may indeed enjoy some unexplained immunity from suffering, but I fail to see how they can possess the honor of the kingdom." And then we have the quotation from St. Gregory Nazianzen in his Oration 40, section 23, where St. Gregory says, "And so also in those who fail to receive the gift, some are altogether animal or bestial, according as they are either foolish or wicked. And this, I think, has to be added to their other sins, that they have no reverence at all for this gift, but look upon it as a mere gift, that is baptism, to be acquiesced in if it gives them, and if not given them, then to be neglected. Others know and honor the gift, that is baptism, but put it off, some through laziness, some through greediness. Others are not in a position to receive it, perhaps on account of infancy, or some perfectly involuntary circumstance through which they are prevented from receiving it, even if they wish. As then in the former case we found much difference, so too in this. They who altogether despise it are worse than they who neglect it through greed or carelessness. These are worse than they who have lost the gift through ignorance or tyranny, for tyranny is nothing but an involuntary error. And I think that the first will have to suffer punishment, as for all their sins, so for their contempt of baptism, and that the second will also have to suffer, but less, because it was not so much through wickedness as through folly that they wrought their failure. And the third, that is, those who cannot be baptized because of something like infants, will be neither glorified nor punished by the righteous judge as unsealed and not yet wicked, but persons who have suffered rather than done wrong. For not everyone who is not bad enough to be punished is good enough to be honored, just as not everyone who is not good enough to be honored is bad enough to be punished. And I look upon it as well from another point of view. If you judge the murderously disposed man by his will alone, apart from the act of murder, then you may reckon as baptized him who desired baptism apart from the reception of baptism. But if you cannot do the one, how can you do the other? I cannot see it. Or if you like, we will put it thus. If desire in your opinion has equal power with actual baptism, then judge in the same way in regard to glory, and you may be content with longing for it as if that were itself glory. And what harm is done you by your not attaining the actual glory as long as you have the desire for it? And I think that basically covers it about that question. So I'm just saying that as far as I can tell, that the position that's I've seen in Orthodox writing is, at least for the past 1,000 years, has been that we were sure infants, unbaptized infants, when they die, aren't sent to the punishments of hell.
Yeah.
So we can say what else happens to them. In fact, there's kind of a view that do they go to the upper levels of Hades, which are not punishment, and that gets into the whole limbo question. And although technically limbo means limbus, it means the outer region. It's not really describing a third or fourth area. There's only really two areas. There's the heavenly regions, which is paradise, and then there's the other higher levels of heaven, I would say, and then there's the general area we call Hades, which has like the lower regions, which is like punishments, and then there's the upper regions, which where certain Orthodox Christians go who die for a period of time and such. So someone was asking me about that statement I had made. Another point, I think someone had misunderstood me when I made some of my comments last week when I was talking about interpolations and manuscripts, and I was stating that Thomas Aquinas, who is a papist saint, he had written this book called Contra Graecium, I think, or Graecorum. Yeah. And a lot of the material he used in that book was from interpolated sources. It wasn't that he himself had his own works interpolated, but he was using fraudulent material. I don't know if he knew it was fraudulent or not.
But there's a good chance he didn't.
Yeah. But I'm not defending him, and he's still a heretic. But I'm just saying, if you actually look at his that book, and there's actually translations of it online, and you start looking at the source quotes, like they have these little like electronic like numbers, and you can click on them, and it says like from most of them, source not found, not exist in any manuscript, and et cetera, or found in corrupted manuscript.
Which means that there's a lot. That's another thing we have to realize is that the 13th century was a period also where a lot of these manuscripts that were faulty began to come into question. Like I believe it was within 100 years of Aquinas that they.
Whoa, wait a minute. Aquinas wasn't saying. Aquinas actually thought these manuscripts were genuine.
Right. No, I know that.
My point is that he was building his argument upon so much that was completely faulty to begin with.
Right. I'm not disputing that, but what I'm saying is that in the period after Aquinas, a lot of these sources that would lead to the Hildebrandian party, so on and so forth, like the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals, were eventually discovered to be frauds.
Yeah, that kind of happened, I think, in the late 1300s and the 1400s. That was one of the good things about the Renaissance period, if you can say that, was that scholars got access to a lot more material. Right. I mean, not everything that happened in the Renaissance was just was absolutely evil. I mean, some was actually good in that people were learning Greek and all this other stuff, and they were beginning to think, what about all these manuscripts? And we have a lot of corrupted material. But the problem is, by the time you get to the mid 1400s in the Papist West, they had been away from the church for basically 300 years, and so there wasn't much. They had everything that was all the fraudulent and manuscripts that had kind of bolstered and kept the papacy alive and created the schism. What's so ironic is that they got rid of them, and they recognized they were all fraudulent by the late 1400s. But they still kept the schism.
Right. They couldn't draw a conclusion from it because they had already lost the sense of what had happened.
Yes.
But now that's the only reason that I'm bringing this up is because of the fact that Thomas Aquinas himself might have thought these were legitimate documents, but they've already by now probably were already so long recognized as frauds that they were just thrown away.
Well, that's why that one work, which was called Contra Graecorum, I believe.
Yeah.
That's where that one work is not really read anymore by a lot of Roman Catholic apologists for apologetics reasons, because if you tried to use that, you'd be laughed at.
Right.
Because it's like a curiosity now. But it's useful to say, look, this is how bad the situation was. That even a figure who was at a university in the West and how they had access to a lot more material than anybody else could. He was not. Exactly. He was not able to get reliable material. So you can imagine, how bad it must have been even 150 years before.
Oh yeah, no, definitely.
So it was a pretty terrible situation. Do you recall if we have any other questions, Father, from last time?
Well, one of the things that was brought up last time, and I think that this is one of the things I wanted to talk about, is that towards the end of the last broadcast, somebody asked, "Wait, are you guys in schism?" And then somebody said, "Yeah, they're in schism." And I mean, I'd like to talk about schism and heresy and that a little bit because, not because of the fact that I'm going to take a position. That's not even the issue. But if we just talk about how schism works. And right now people are getting a chance to see that, play out between Moscow and Constantinople. The concept of schism and separation is one that basically, where there has to be a right or a wrong side. Mm-hmm. It's one of these things where you can't just say, well, I mean, granted, there were schisms that happened over nothing, not nothing, but really, immaterial things.
Well, remember St. Basil in his canonical letter called sometimes called Canon 1 of St. Basil, but it's really letter 188 that he wrote to St. Philochius. I got it right before me, and St. Basil says that by heresies they, that is the fathers, meant men who were altogether broken off and alienated in matters relating to the actual faith. By schisms they meant men who had separated for some ecclesiastical reason in questions capable of mutual solution, and then by unlawful congregations or parasynagogues, gatherings held by disorderly bishops or priests or by uninstructed laymen. So we have those, differences. For example, St. Basil said, if, for instance, a man be convicted of a crime and prohibited from discharging his ministerial functions, and then refuses to submit to the canons, but arrogates to himself episcopal and ministerial rights, and persons leave the Catholic Church and join him, this is an unlawful assembly. To disagree with members of the Church about repentance is schism. Instances of heresy are those of the Manichaeans, the Valentinians, the Marcionites, and such. So a schism is basically when, if somebody said, I don't agree with the, I think Patriarch Michael is a big fat guy. He's just too overweight, and I don't like it. So I'm not going to commemorate him anymore. You're schismatic then.
Yeah,
because that's not a doctrinal reason. You cannot,
it's not a valid charge.
Just because you think he's too overweight or he drinks too much or whatever. That may be wrong, and he may have to and you may have to admonish him, and maybe even whatever.
Put him on keto.
Although I don't think there's a canon to actually depose a fat guy, but but anyway, my point is
there be.
But my point, all of us have been fat guys at one point or another. But anyway, my point is that if you're just breaking over that's a schism. You're a schismatic. But if, like, the patriarch or the archbishop or the metropolitan is saying that all religions are the same, or papism is really part of the church, that's a doctrinal issue he's teaching. And if he's teaching it bareheaded, you have to separate from him.
Right.
That's a big issue.
And again, it's not an attack on anyone who is.
I just think the terms of people using these terms without really understanding what a schismatic is as opposed to a heretic.
Right. And if someone wants to charge, heresy, I welcome it. We will gladly answer any charges of heresy.
Yes.
But in any case, so again, I'm not judging anyone, but it's important to understand the Orthodox position on schism before you throw the word out. And
technically, for example, the old believers would have originally been a kind of a schismatic, but then I think some of the old believers actually became heretics, like the ones who did priestless ones, for example.
Yeah.
All right. And even the ones that kept priests, how were they explaining all this? And you can say on the one hand, they didn't really think it out. They weren't that educated, so that could have saved them from being called heretics. But on the other hand, some were saying that God had removed the episcopate, and the episcopate could only be restored if an old believer priest chrismated a bishop. And then there's how do they get priests? They got priests by convincing people to leave the Russian Orthodox official church and join them and such. So you can that would be kind of like a schismatic, I guess. There was a group called the Meletians that existed in Egypt in the 4th century that were formed by this one presbyter who kind of went around saying he was a bishop, but he was never really made a bishop by anybody. And he just didn't, and he wanted to, I can't remember, I think he had wanted to be a bishop, but he got in some big fight with St. Athanasius. Yeah. And so he just started doing the Ukrainian thing of making, or the Polish thing. Hodor did it too. Mm-hmm. So, of claiming he was a bishop and making bishops and things. And later the Meletians kind of just, I think they got actually a consecration from somebody, but then they kind of just faded away and reunited with the church after a few decades.
Yeah,
because there was no doctrinal issue, there was nothing to keep them apart, as opposed to Arian heretics, who really did not believe the Orthodox faith. That's a heretic. They're not now Arian heretics would have been people that were not just they would have been schismatics and heretics, because you can be a schismatic and a heretic because you're not just broken from the church, you're also teaching things that are not part of the faith.
Exactly.
So a heretic is someone who just breaks over some non-dogmatic reason.
No, you mean a schismatic, not a heretic.
Schismatic. I'm sorry. A schismatic is someone who breaks over a non-dogmatic reason.
Right.
A schismatic heretic is someone who breaks over by teaching something that's not part of the Orthodox faith, contrary to it.
Pretty much.
So, and then you have the unlawful congregations or the parasynagogues, and I'm not really, I'm not sure. There are probably a few instances of those in history. That's more.
That's basically all of Protestantism.
Well, a parasynagogue is well. Oh no, not well. I mean, a parasynagogue. Saint Basil is saying is kind of like one step from being a schism. He says it's an unlawful congregation of priests and bishops and uninstructed laymen. It's kind of like, I guess, if like imagine if a bunch of bishops got together and they said, we don't like the archbishop or the metropolitan, and they didn't break from the church, where they started causing a bunch of trouble. And
I was under the impression that unlawful assemblies were broad enough that, I mean, if they can be led by uninstructed laymen.
Well, I'm saying the Protestants are just. I don't think the Protestants can qualify because they're technically heretics. I mean, I'm just saying they were a schismatic heresy from a schismatic heresy, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Okay.
For example, Saint Basil says, as to those who assembled in unlawful congregations, their decision was to join them again to the church after they have been brought to a better state by proper repentance and rebuke and so on. In many cases, when men in orders have rebelled with disorderly, to receive them on their repentance into the same rank. So that's kind of, they haven't been deposed, but they're still disobedient. That's kind of an unlawful assembly and such. But I think that's, do you have any more comments about that subject?
Well, yeah, I mean, and so, just to address it personally, the biggest thing and the most important thing is ultimately, and I'm not going to do a spirited defense of my synod here, but the point is, when one is schismatic, they have to be schismatic from someone. And we're not actually schismatic from anyone because we were formed as a Western synod by the Old Calendarists. You could argue that the Old Calendarists were in schism from the Church of Greece, but we're technically an autonomous body. We're not, there's no, I guess you could say we're in schism from Rome, but, Rome doesn't mean anything to us. So.
Well, no, we can't be in schism. Schism would mean, you got to remember, we're so used to saying everybody's in schism from somebody. Yeah, but I'm saying that technically, we're not in schism from anybody, because to be in schism, we'd have to be broken for we're not broken from the church for non-dogmatic reason.
Exactly, and so the point is, we follow more that canon that talks about restoring widowed sees than schism, because basically, if our mission is the West and that's our synod's personal mission, direct mission is the Western lands, then that's our competition is Rome.
Now you can have historical circumstances in which it's very, very difficult to determine who is in fact a lawful congregation, a schismatic, a non-schismatic. That actually can happen in historical instances.
And it has.
Where, for example, exactly, like in the 4th century and during the whole Arian heresy, St. Basil in his book on the Holy Ghost, at the very end of it, he talks about this, how you had all the Orthodox were like, or agreed they didn't want to be Arians, but they were like deposing each other.
Well, it's because Greece now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and the problem is that you can't really. Who is the legitimate? Who is this? The question is that who is the sole legitimate authority in a certain area? And that create. If no one can solve that issue, then how do you call anybody else a schismatic? Now you can say, well, they broke from my synod and they didn't have a reason and all the rest. But that how do you enforce that? How do you make that a binding, universally enforcing decree? If you know what I mean? Because it's a quagmire that it's very difficult to extricate yourself from. For example, and this was something recently in the news, the whole Ivan Mazeppa. Now, do you know the story of Ivan Mazeppa?
Yeah.
Okay. For those who don't, Ivan Mazeppa, I believe, I might be wrong here, but he was the hetman or the leader of the Cossacks, and basically kind of the Ukrainian leader in the early 1700s.
Yeah, no, you're right on that.
And Ivan Mazeppa was allied with Peter the Great, and he was fighting with the Russians. All right, and however, Ivan Mazeppa at one point felt that Peter the Great was going to abolish whatever was left of the autonomy of the Ukrainian Cossacks.
Yeah, the hetman.
And exactly. And remember, they had this Treaty of Pereslavo back in the 1600s, and it was like there were like 2 of them, and they were supposed to confirm the unity of the Ukrainians and Russians, but they were each supposed to respect each other's power and authority. Well, what transpired was that Mazeppa began to believe that Peter the Great was going to violate this, and so Mazeppa basically turned on Peter the Great and allied with Charles XII, the King of Sweden. And as a result of this, the Russian Orthodox Church put a personal anathema Like this is what in the West they would call major excommunication. You know what I mean? It's like not just you can't go to the sacrament, you're like condemned, you know, in the solemn service and such. Yeah, they put in a personal anathema on Ivan Mazepa. Though Ivan Mazepa never recognized it, and he just went to parts of southern Ukraine or parts of southern, I guess, further south where they was under the ecumenical patriarch, and he apparently died in communion with the ecumenical patriarchate in the early 1700s. So, why was I bringing that up again? I'm not quite sure.
I'm not exactly sure.
I was going somewhere with it, but now I've lost my train of thought on
heresy and schism.
Yeah. Well, okay. So the question is, he would be like, I guess, kind of from the Russian Orthodox view, a schismatic. You know,
okay. I
guess, and then the people with him, he would be, I guess, kind of like that's how they would think of him, and that's been brought up in the news because of the whole Filaret Denisenko stuff in Kiev, and how he had an anathema put on him in '97 by the Moscow Patriarchate. And the ecumenical patriarchate was saying recently that, well, we don't recognize this anathema, just like we don't recognize the anathema against Ivan Mazepa, because Ivan Mazepa died in communion with the ecumenical patriarchate in the early 1700s. You know, so that's
you can even have these long simmering wounds from schisms lasting 300 years.
Yeah, I mean that's an example. I mean, and you know, for example, in Antioch. And I believe I told this account earlier. In Antioch, you had the whole situation between the old Nicenes, so-called Eustathians, who did not recognize the deposition of Saint Eustathius and never recognized any of the succeeding bishops appointed in Antioch after him. And then later, Saint Meletius, who was the bishop of Sebastia, was made bishop of Antioch. Now, Saint Meletius had originally been consecrated by Acacians. And Acacians were the dominant party of the Arians that controlled the East. So, you know, even, you know, Meletius was recognized as kind of, St. Meletius originally is recognized as one of the, like, kind of Arians. And Acacius was Caesarea, who was called the leader of the Arians. He was, in fact, called the tongue of the Arians. And St. Gregory Nazianzen, in one of his sermons, talks about him. But he would not even mention Acacius' name because he was so despised. And so St. Meletius is eventually elected bishop of Antioch, and the Arians put him in charge because I guess the Arians thought, oh, he's our man. And remember, this is after Nicaea when there's like an anathema against the Arians. So this is you don't even get into the question of condemned versus uncondemned heresy, you know. Right. And then St. Meletius is like begins to teach, you know, uncontroversial moral things, you know, like his moral preaching and such. We should be not, you know, virtues and such. And then it gets to the point where he out of nowhere, so seemingly, teaches complete Orthodox Trinitarianism. You know, there's the famous account in his life where he lifts up his hands and he touches his thumb, his forefinger, and his middle finger together, and puts his ring finger and his pinky finger in his palm, and teaches the Trinity. All right, and the Arians were just shocked at this because remember he had been consecrated as an Arian bishop, and then he goes suddenly to become an Orthodox bishop.
Yeah.
You know, and the majority of people in Antioch kind of accepted it because even though they had all these Arian bishops like Euzoius and Eudoxus, etc., the Arian bishops of Antioch before Meletius and after Eustathius, they didn't really persecute intensely the Orthodox laity as long as you were part of the official church. I think they just thought, well, you know, we don't care what you do as long as we get to make the priests. You know what I mean? Eventually, that's how heretics are. They can take over the hierarchy. They can eventually just control the church, you know, to control that body. What happened is Paulinus, who was the leader of the Old Orthodox, who had never accepted any Arian bishops whatsoever, he had like a small congregation, probably less than 1% of the population of Antioch, if at that, said, well, we don't care. And Meletius, even if he now says he's teaching Orthodoxy, he was consecrated an Arian. He was ordained an Arian. So how does he now claim he's Orthodox? We don't accept any of his ordinations. All right. And there were two Western bishops that were sent from Italy to the East to try to fix this situation. One was named Saint Eusebius of Vercelli, and the other was called Luciferus of Cagliari. And they had met with St. Athanasius to say, well, how are we going to fix the situation with this Meletius and with Paulinus? And so they kind of were on their way there, but Luciferus kind of arrived in Antioch first, and he met with Paulinus because Luciferus and Paulinus were kind of much more alike in how they dealt with things. And Luciferus' view was that, well, Meletius was ordained by Arian, so we're not going to accept anything he does. But St. Meletius' argument was that, look, I'm confessing the Orthodox faith. Most of the people are with me. We're against the Arian heresy. Can't you, try to find some way to go into communion with us? And Luciferus and, basically the rest of them said no. And so Luciferus then single-handedly consecrated Paulinus to be Patriarch of Antioch, which just complicated the situation for I think, like 25, 30, 40 years longer.
Yeah.
Because even after Paulinus died, he made a successor before he died, and that lasted even longer. And
it's
then
worth noting that we call this period the golden age of the church now.
Well, it was the golden age in the sense that you had all these great saints and doctors like Saint Athanasius, the Cappadocian Fathers, and the times of them being tried. You know what I mean? Under Arian persecution, Arian heresy was when they began to shine, because they had to formulate. And the Orthodox faith was there, but you had to, as in apologetics, and that's what they were doing. Really, they were doing apologetics against heretics. You had to formulate much more exactly how you answered things.
Exactly.
All right. So the Cappadocians moved, Roman Catholics must understand this. They didn't develop, invent the theology, but they had to develop the terminology more. There's a difference between terminological development and doctrinal development. The doctrine is set, it's still there. And as a result, the Cappadocians, for example, had to say, well, we have to have a clear distinction between hypostasis and ousia. Whereas this is one of the problems years before, there had not been among some of the Nicenes a clear distinction between hypostasis and ousia. All right. In fact, this is one of the questions. If you look in the Latin terminology, do you know what the exact Latin translation of the word hypostasis is? It's substantia.
Right.
However, substantia came to mean what we think in Greek as ousia, or essence. All right. And so in the Latins would talk about tres personae, or and una substantia. And the Greek, but however, by the Cappadocians would say, there's, I don't know the Greek phrase, but it was like, 3 hypostasis and 1 ousia. All right. In fact, Saint Augustine talks about how it would actually make more sense, Saint Augustine says, to use essentia instead of substantia. And Saint Isidore of Seville, even the 590s, talks about this, but he says, well, we're stuck with what we have.
Well, I'll tell you, what's interesting is that distinction even shows up in the translation of the Vulgate known as the Douay Rheims, where you see in the translation of Matthew, it doesn't say give us a stare daily bread. It uses the term related to essence and actually says it's
super substantial, doesn't it, or something like that?
Yeah, give us this day our super substantial bread.
Because I think the Greek phrase is epiousion.
Right.
And now a lot of the fathers interpret that phrase in the Lord's Prayer as referring to the Eucharist. That's the epiousion. That's the ultimate meaning. I mean, there are other meanings, but that's the ultimate meaning, that we should have the daily Eucharist and such. But anyway, my point was that in Antioch you had all these problems, and Saint Basil talks about it at the end of On the Holy Spirit, and from his words, it's pretty evident that it's just more than Antioch, because if whoever controlled Antioch is going to radiate throughout Syria. You know what I mean? Because if Paulinus was claiming to be patriarch, Meletius was claiming to be patriarch. They were 2 Orthodox patriarchs. They were condemning each other as heretics. Well, Meletius actually, I don't think St. Meletius was really, I think they did. I think St. Meletius, they did begin to attack and Paulinus is in fact considered a saint in some calendars, but they only began to do that after Paulinus was attacking them for years and years. Because St. Meletius was like attacked by everybody. And St. Meletius did not want to attack people, but what was happening is they were taking his people and saying they're not really baptized. And so at that point, for example, St. John Chrysostom was ordained a deacon, I believe, and maybe even a priest by St. Meletius. All right? And that's why St. John Chrysostom always defended St. Meletius. However, in Palestine, St. Jerome, who lived in Bethlehem, kind of seems to represent the feeling in parts of Palestine among the monks that they did not like St. Meletius. In fact, to his dying day, St. Jerome never considered St. Meletius to be a saint. He considered him to basically be a fraud, a kind of like someone who's like trying to get the best deal and portray themselves as something they're not. What's that called? Are you there, Father?
Yeah, kind of a fraud of some sort. Not a fraud.
like a opportunist.
Okay, yeah.
All right, so for example, if you read Saint Jerome's writings,
A lot of opinions on a lot.
and that happens oftentimes, where people say, well, they didn't really believe this, and they, etc. And Saint Jerome, that's his view, and he was later held to be wrong. The church did not accept Saint Jerome's view, but it's interesting when Saint Jerome reposed in the early 400s, he never accepted Saint Meletius as a saint, even though Saint Meletius was acclaimed throughout the church by that period. He just never accepted it because he was a supporter of Paulinus. He was in fact ordained a priest by Paulinus, and so it's almost like if you go to the the old calendar issue, the difference between the Matthewites and the Florinites. You know what I mean? That's kind of exactly how it is if you actually study it. Paulinus would be almost like Matthew, where Chrysostomos would kind of be like Meletius. I mean, although not exactly. I mean, they actually had a better claim. I mean, Chrysostomos wasn't ordained by open heretics or anything. But that's kind of the attitudes. But that's oftentimes repeated throughout church history.
Well, that's kind of what, I mean, we see that there's a lot of people who are fighting for tradition from within the canonical bodies, and we want to help them. We hear a lot of the time, we need a new St. Mark of Ephesus. We probably need a new St. Meletius.
Well, again, the problem is that you're going to have to be willing to take massive amounts of abuse from everybody. Because that's what happened to St. Meletius. Remember, there's even this debate when St. Meletius was at the Second Ecumenical Council. There's a lot of discussion that he did not even, that supposedly whoever, I can't remember who the Pope of Rome at the time was, did not accept him into the communion. In fact, this is an argument against papal supremacy, and that you have in this concept that you have to be in communion with the Pope to be a saint. That a lot of scholars, it's generally accepted that St. Meletius did not die in communion with Rome. Because they did not, remember, they technically still recognized Paulinus at the time. All right? And then now it gets even worse when you consider St. Cyril of Jerusalem. Because, for example, now, and again, if you go to St. Jerome and you go to a few other chroniclers who lived through that, they again did not like, some of them, St. Jerome, for example, did not like St. Cyril of Alexandria. Not Alexandria, St. Cyril of Jerusalem. Because St. Jerome and a lot of the other monks, again, they considered St. Cyril of Jerusalem to basically be, they consider him to be worse than St. Meletius. Because originally, according to St. Jerome, St. Cyril, when he succeeded, I think it was St. Maximus, he had to agree, if he wanted to be Bishop of Jerusalem, he had to agree to be reordained by the Arians. And St. Jerome says he actually did agree to do that. Now, some people say that's actually not true, that people slandered him about that. But St. Jerome and others seem to believe that he did that, and then he later kind of came out against the Arians after he got made bishop. We don't quite know about what happened. And there's this whole big question about if, St. Cyril was ordained by the Arians and then he later came out as Orthodox, how was he ever canonically elected a bishop? Because I think Socrates, the Byzantine historian, or Sozomenus, records that supposedly the Second Ecumenical Council issued this decree exonerating St. Cyril of Alexandria as canonically elected. Now, I don't think this is. I don't think we have it. We have this letter. We have this letter only in the works of either Socrates or Sozomenus, because a lot of times the full acts of the First and Second Council are kind of like not even there. It's all kind of problematic. But this is not to attack St. Cyril. This is of Jerusalem. That's not what I'm doing. I'm just saying that's how many people at the time were saying that, saying about him, who were other Orthodox saying that about him, who would have nothing to do with him, and such. And one of the accusations people brought against St. Cyril of Jerusalem was that if you read his works, he never used the word homoousios to refer to the relationship between the Father and the Son. Although it's very clearly evident if you read his sermons that he believed the Son was eternal and uncreated. All right? So it's not that, though it's pretty clear he believed the same thing as the other Orthodox and such. And that in church historians kind of term this called the New Nicenes. That is, you have the Old Nicenes, which are kind of like the original people from Nicaea and those who kind of kept to that. And then the New Nicenes are supposed to be those kind of bishops in the late 360s and 370s that kind of left the Akakians or the mainline Arians who kind of controlled the mainline church. And they kind of were like, well, I guess we were wrong about some of this stuff. And they kind of came to the Orthodox conclusions. And that's kind of what the Second Ecumenical Council, one of the big things it was about, was to unite all these parties. All right. And the emperor was what? St. Theodosius, I believe, was the emperor in 381. and he was widely respected, and everybody respected him, so he could just say, look, everybody's got to assemble, and then he forces a settlement. Not that he's forcing doctrine, because he's saying, look, you have to make an agreement. You know, kind of like 12 angry men, put them all in the same room. They can, they're angry, but they respect the emperor, and he's not going to allow them to leave until they solve the problems.
I'm trying to see how it would look like if you did this in Greece.
It would be, it'd be 100 angry. It would be much worse.
100 angry bishops, food fights. Okay.
I mean, what would happen? The problem is that without an emperor to do this, I think it would be much more difficult, because the culture has changed so much. Because in that old culture, even up into the early modern period, there was so much respect for a figure that you believe was the anointed, God-anointed king. There was so much honor given to the man.
I think that, yeah, but the other, and I will.
I mean, who are we going to do? Was it Donald Trump going to go there and to make some agreement or something like that? I mean,
going to make Byzantium great again. No, that's what. Here's the other thing. The other way this worked out, and we've seen this with the Iconoclast controversy, is ultimately the best emperor is sometimes death. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the times, the people who are in the midst of all these struggles and the heroic confessors who are doing the right thing, so on and so forth, don't like each other. So they have to die. And then once they die, their followers eventually...
We mean of a natural death. That's what we mean.
Yeah. We don't
not like they have to die. Like, assassination squads or anything.
With a machine gun, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying that,
you got to remember, many of these people who were...
fan, by the way. So.
But just in their defense, many people who were confessors in the midst of all this, like in the Arian heresy and the persecution, from their own perspective, they had very legitimate reasons to not like. Paulinus had, from his perspective, and St. Jerome agreed, and he had supporters not to like St. Meletius, and vice versa. And now we can look at it, 500, 1,000 years, 1,500 years, from, removed, and be very cool and collected and look at all the historical sources and say, well, he didn't know this, he didn't know that. But if you're in the midst of it, and you're Paulinus of Antioch, and you've been holding out the true faith for 25 years, or 30 years,
suddenly some Arian guy
and then he comes in and he's like a Johnny come lately, and then you're like, now he's claiming to teach orthodoxy after all these years, and I was being persecuted, and we had these small churches, and we weren't even allowed to have buildings, and we were always faithful, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to look very much different to you, who, you have kind of the siege mentality, and this other guy comes in and everybody likes him.
Yeah.
And you should say, well, maybe, and from Paulinus's perspective, he might have thought, is this a trick? Is this guy going to change his views, a year later?
Exactly.
I don't really know. And now what happened, however, I should note, by the late 370s or the early 380, around 380, I think, there was some sort of agreement. Maybe it was around the Second Ecumenical Council. There was an agreement, kind of bartered between St. Meletius and St. Paulinus of Antioch, like a communion agreement. And it was, some argue that it was only on paper, basically, but it kind of existed. All right. However, the agreement was this: that whoever dies first, they aren't to consecrate a successor. All right. They're not to have a successor. Okay. And then the next, so if St. Meletius passes away, Paulinus kind of gets to lead his group, but they don't elect a new patriarch of Antioch until Paulinus dies. Right. That way, both groups come together after both of their leaders are dead, and they can have a common person elected. Because I think but however, that's not what happened. Paulinus basically St. Paulinus never trusted St. Meletius, and around that period before he died, he single-handedly consecrated in a single-hand consecration Evagrius of Antioch, and what happened is Alexandria and Rome, instead of like siding with the successors of Saint Meletius, the people whom Saint John Chrysostom was with, they decided, well, we're just going to go with Evagrius, which made it even worse.
Yep.
All right, and then I think what happened is Evagrius died in the 390s, and they kind of had another successor to lead the Paulinian party. But at that point, I think Pope St. Anastasius and I can't remember who the Patriarch of Antioch was. Alexandria was in the 390s. They at that point said, well, this is just too much. We can't continue to support this. And so they withdrew all recognition from the successor of Agrius. And at that point, the Eustathians kind of just, within a few years, disappeared and reunited with the mainline patriarch in Antioch. All right. So that kind of faded away, but it faded, like you said, it faded away because by the 390s and then the early 400s, there wasn't really a reason for them to be anymore. And they were welcomed back into the mainline and Orthodox Antiochian Patriarchate without any bad ill feelings. And, that was a big point. You didn't want to continue to antagonize them, Yeah. And it kind of just faded away, and no one really remembered it it was kind of a memory by the time you get to the 420s and 30s, even if you had some people in their 90s alive.
The moral of this extremely long story is very simple. Schismatic can mean something, but a lot of the times it doesn't.
Yes. Again, a schismatic is someone who separates over non-dogmatic reasons.
Exactly.
Here is that.
Okay.
So anyway, it's a lot of church history to get through that, and it's another point to make about this that Roman Catholics often bring up, which is that when you criticize all the different heresies in the Roman Catholic Church, Roman Catholics will oftentimes say, "Well, look at the Arian heresy. The church was full of Arians." Well, that's not quite true, because technically the Arians were a distinct body from the Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
They took over the official structures, and the Orthodox didn't want to be part of them. Now, what is true, however, is and this is again and this is why I encourage people to read that volume of the Erdmann series, which is volume 3, concerning all the church histories. It talks about how, for example, Saint Basil. I'm not quite sure if St. Basil ever held communion with St. Athanasius, maybe near the end. And people can correct me on this. I mean, they wrote letters, but I'm not quite sure if they ever held official communion. And that's because St. Basil held communion with St. Mellitus of Antioch. All right? And, hold on.
Oh, is that the dogs?
Yeah, hold on. Keep talking. I got to mute myself. Hold on.
All right, no problem. Anyway, so we're here taking questions, and we basically will, our job. It's not that, Orthodox apologetics is something that anyone can do if they study the fathers and they learn the fathers. They can start a YouTube channel just like we did. The point is, there's no apologetic certificate or anything like that. In any case, so if you have questions, or if you have challenges, if you want to, let's say, if you're a Roman Catholic listening or a Protestant listening, you want to say, hey, this is why you're wrong. Please, we welcome that. The whole point of apologetics is to give a ready answer. Earlier today, I was, somebody had asked, well, what's the point? If aren't we supposed to focus on, becoming better people spiritually? Well, yeah, we are. And and that's something that's true. No matter what you do, you can't be an apologist without being a Christian. But the point is, we still have to be Christians, and those of us who want to defend the faith should know how. And so, this is something that we're going to keep on doing. It's, ultimately, we've seen the past 100 years of ecumenism. People are rejecting it left and right. They realize you can't just make everything into subjectivism. You can't just say the truth and not the truth can totally be in communion. That's not that's not what's going to answer anything. What you have to be able to do is promote the truth and protect it and defend it. Because if you believe in it, that's the most important thing you can do. As for, Father Enoch is still gone with the dogs, but the point is that, he'll be back soon. So I'm just looking here. I noticed that we use the Orthodox Apologetics War Room /Warzone on Facebook if you're on it. And that's basically where we spend a lot of, a lot of our time discussing this, because we want to see the next generation of Orthodox apologists, grow and be stronger. There's a fascinating thread, if you are on that, on Monophysite versus Orthodox Christology. I think more people need to, they need to learn that Orthodoxy is unique. The church is unique. It is something that basically it's the body of Christ. And without that, it's hard to say, because, we live in a pluralistic society. And when you live in a pluralistic society, it's like, what am I going to tell my cousins? What am I going to tell my mom? So on and so forth. I watched a very interesting video that was on that on the War Zone that someone put up. It was a Protestant guy, but the point is he converted to, Christianity on reading the Quran. And so then he realized that the Quran talks about the word of God. And so when he brought up it was the word God or not, that turned into a huge fight, and his family tried to kill him and fun stuff like that. But the point is that struggle for the faith is central. Struggle for the name of Christ is central, and if we're not able to do that, if we're just saying, well, we're just going to hide in our little rooms and just say prayers by ourselves, we're not doing our job. Our job is to preach the gospel. And that means, when Jehovah's Witnesses come to your door, you've got to be willing to answer them and offer them a cup of water because they've probably been walking. Same with the Mormons. Same with all of these different groups. We're supposed to be reaching out to these people and telling them you're not part of the church, but you can be. And that's not a negative thing. To offer somebody the chance at salvation is a huge, huge deal. So this is something that, we should be doing all the time. Will all Orthodox do it? No. The truth of the matter is, most of the time, people who do apologetics, and this has been true basically since Christianity started, you're accused of zealotry. But we're supposed to be zealous for our Father's house. We're supposed to be zealous for the faith once delivered to the saints. And that is that's something that we are going to, you can't stop it. When that stops, and this is the whole point of ecumenism, why I was discussing with Father Enoch earlier, why it's a pan-heresy. And the reason why it's a pan-heresy is because ecumenism makes other heresies irrelevant, because none of them are heresies anymore. They're all just perfectly acceptable, ways to live. And so when that Jehovah's Witness comes to the door with his, made-up 18th century religion, you've just got to be like, well, okay, buddy, I guess we're all good now. No, you have to tell him the truth. And the truth is he's not in the church. And sometimes they don't want to hear that. I mean, I had Jehovah's Witnesses come to my door probably about 2.5 weeks ago. I guess they were having some national meeting or something nearby, and they were inviting people. And I thought that was kind of funny. I was like, well, this is a new tack. You're not offering me the watchtower. But I was like, I said, well, I really don't know if I can, if this is something I want to discuss. I mean, I'm busy. You're obviously very busy with your little convention there. So I was like, look, I respect the fact that you're out here. Do you want water? Obviously, they've gotten used to people offering them water because they whipped out these plastic bottles. They're like, we've got our own drinks. I'm like, okay, great. So, and I said, you do realize that I'm Orthodox, and what you're talking about it's nonsense. And I was polite, but I said it's nonsense. And I said, because we had these debates on whether Arius was right or not, 1700 years ago. We're not going to start having those debates again because he was wrong then, and then what's it called? I brought up, I said if that was not the case, then your New World Translation of the Scriptures wouldn't have had to change John 1:1, but it did. And so they were like, well, I said, because the word was God. And he's like, well, and then he's like, I'm like, there's no indefinite article there. And he's like, but what if there was an indefinite article? I'm like, but there wasn't. And so, the point is that eventually you realize that, a lot of these guys, and a lot of these, I hate to say this, but a lot of the people preaching on the streets have no idea what they're talking about either. And that's something that you, as an Orthodox Christian, if you're listening, you have the wealth of the knowledge of the fathers of the church to defend the faith. All you have to do is study what they're saying, and then you get it too. It's not complicated. That's the beauty of it, is that, if Orthodox Christians spent more time on apologetics, then what would happen would be that we would see the church grow to new dimensions. We may not have time. History may not let us. We may have allowed globalism may have allowed the rise of Islam to finally come and, kill us all. But the point is, we have to keep trying.
I'm back.
Oh, hi.
All right.
Okay. So did we have other questions or?
Yeah. Someone sent me a question and they said, I will be interested in hearing, they gave their 3 questions. They said, I would be interested in hearing 1, Orthodox Latin opposition to the Filioque and unleavened bread. That is, those who actively opposed it, not just lack of the addition, but actual making an issue of it. 2, Orthodox proselytism or missionary activity between the 1054 schism and the 1700s. And 3, the history of the Uniates, Greek, Slavic, Maronite, Coptic, Syriac, Ethiopian, etc., and how they are essentially proto-ecumenist, etc. So, okay, so first off...
that's some big thoughts there.
I know. Okay, so first off, Orthodox Latin opposition to the Filioque and unleavened bread. Let me handle the unleavened bread issue first.
Sure.
I subscribe to the school of thought that you don't really see unleavened bread come about as a thing in the West until the 11th century. I don't really buy the idea that it was, a common thing in the 9th or the 10th century.
Yeah, I don't.
And the reason I say that is because you still look in, and we had this discussion on one of the other Facebook groups we were having, that if you look at the 10th century canonical regulations in the Western Church, and let me pull this up real quick. It was written by the abbot of the Imperial Monastery of Prüm in Germany, and his name was Abbot Regino of Prüm. And Abbot Regino says, here we go. Abbot Regino says that when you reserve the Eucharist, he says, when the sacred oblation which sacred oblation are to be dipped in the blood of Christ, that the presbyter may truly be able to say to the infirm, may the body and blood of the Lord profit thee. And then he instructs them in Book 1, Chapter 71 of Abbot Regino's book called Libri Duo de Synodalibus Causis et Disciplinis Ecclesiasticus, which meant 2 books concerning synodical causes and disciplinary ecclesiastical discipline, that the Eucharist is then put into a pyx and reserved. Hold on 1 second. Can you continue, Father? Hold on 1 second, okay?
Sure. Well, I know what he's talking about. He's actually referring to something that was on our Western Orthodox liturgical text and material group, where we look back to basically what the Orthodox Western Fathers were actually teaching. And so basically I'll just read what he's talking about. Let me see here, because the Latin is...
Okay, I'm back. I'm sorry, I just had something take care of.
Well, I pulled up your post, so I was just basically going...
Well, yeah, well, the point is that if you try to take an unleavened wafer and dip it in wine, and that's going to turn into and try to preserve it, that's not going to end very well.
No.
All right. So, sorry, my dogs are barking at something. I don't know.
He has these 2 Shiba Inus. So he has actual Doge dogs. So
yes.
They're
supposed to be mixed with something, but I have no idea what. But they're like that. But my point,
fluffy doggos in the market.
They're very nice dogs. But my point is that, for example, the original manner, and this is kind of neglected later obviously in the post-schism period, but originally in the pre-schism period, when the priest broke the host, and when by the word host, when they used the word host in the 9th and 10th century, they did not mean a coin-shaped unleavened wafer. They're talking about a rounded leavened bread. It looked kind of like an uncut prosper, all right, and it had like a cross seal on it. And what would happen is the priest at pre-schism Western Mass had to break it into 3 pieces. Had to break it into one. They broke it over the chalice. All right, and one large half was set back on the chalice. Then that remaining half was broken in 2, and one of those pieces was put into the chalice, and the other remaining smaller piece was had to be intincted with the blood and then reserved in a box, kind of a pyx box, or broken into pieces. All right. Now later in the post-schism West, they began to, I think, do this practice. I'm not a Roman Catholic. I was never Roman Catholic. Making multiple little unleavened hosts. I think you're familiar with that, Father, right?
Well, the common Roman Catholic practice now is they make one big host.
Oh, they do? Okay.
Yeah, it's like it's a big wafer, and then they break that wafer, and then they kind of...
Well, that's actually more accurate, but I think for a long time they weren't even doing that. I think they were giving out individual hosts and things.
No, they still get... No. The big wafer that nobody gets except the priest.
Okay. Okay, we'll see that. So because obviously, the point was that trying to reserve dipping an unleavened wafer in wine and then pulling out successfully and kind of reserving it, it's not going to go very well. And in fact, years ago there was a person who was kind of an expert on the various Orthodox Celtic liturgical rituals, Stowe Missal, etc. He's passed away now. But he made the point that oftentimes in a lot of the surviving Irish manuals, they had complicated things about dipping one of the pieces of the Eucharist into the chalice multiple times and such. And he made the point that
a fraction of like 21 parts.
Yeah, and he said each of them had to be dipped, and there was all this complicated stuff. I'm not really expert on the Celtic stuff, but his point was that if you tried to do that with unleavened bread, and I think he did it as an experiment, not at a liturgy or anything, but as like a separate experiment, everything just turned to mush completely.
Well,
the point is that a lot of this about the unleavened bread question, a lot of these old canonical prescriptions from the 9th and 10th century presuppose that you have to be using leavened bread, or it really doesn't work that well. So that's a question that's how I answer the question about.
Now I should note, and this is something that is important to note, that it won't end well. But now one person could counter, and this would be an effective counter, would be to say that, well, what about a pita bread? A pita bread is technically unleavened.
No, it's not. I don't think it is.
No, it is. It's unleavened.
Are you sure?
Yeah, but the problem is that if you dip a pita bread in wine, it will spoil, like, very quickly. And so the point is, because you're effectively adding leaven to it, whether you realize it or not, because of the wine. And so it won't work out well.
Okay, now, according to the, at least internet, pita bread is actually slightly leavened bread.
Really?
Yeah, it's actually a slightly form of leavened bread.
I never knew that. I feel so lost now.
Well, but you can see the point about once they began to switch over to unleavened bread in the 11th century, it became pretty difficult to preserve the old canonical prescriptions.
Right.
Eventually, that explains why. And here's another point. This also explains why they began to. One of the reasons they began to give out communion in one kind was because, if you know the history of the precism period, you can kind of explain why how the later customs about, they were kind of like funhouse. You like a funhouse mirror, and you can look at it, and everything's disproportionate and such. If you know the precism history of the West, you can kind of look at the postcism period and say, why do they do this? Why do they, and what happens? They have all these distorted customs. For example, let me give you an example. In England, in the Anglo-Saxon period, in the late 10th and the early 11th century, they had a bad practice, and one of the bad practices they had was that most people did not take communion except for on Pascha and Nativity and Pentecost, I think.
We still have that problem.
Yeah, you're right. But even at a regular Mass, if you came up to the priest before Mass and you're like, well, I want to take communion, the priest would have told you, it's, come to me after Mass and I'll give you communion. Okay? So I don't know why. It is probably, I'm not exactly sure why, but that's kind of how it developed in the late 10th century. So what would happen is that when the priest was having that one piece that was done at the fraction to reserve for the reserved communion for the sick or for other communicants, he basically broke it up into multiple different pieces, and he put it into kind of a chalice container that kind of resembled what we later call kind of these chalice ciboriums, all right? And he intincted the pieces with the blood, all right? And so he set that aside on the altar. Then after Mass was over, and after, I guess they finished the 6th hour, if they did that, anybody who had wanted to take communion would come up to him, and he would open the top of the ciborium, and there would be a server holding, I think, a kind of a napkin under their chin, and he would take the piece of the bodies. Like, let's say there was 10 people. Let's say there was 5 people wanting to take communion. Each of these 5 pieces had been intincted in the blood, and he would put them into the mouth of the person, so they receive communion directly into the mouth. All right, so that kind of became, the norm, for better or worse, if somebody wanted to take communion outside of Pascha or Pentecost. All right. And there are various reasons as to why they did that. I think there was one reason they thought if the whole community as a rule was not taking communion at the Mass, except on Pascha and Pentecost, and you were to do it, they kind of thought, and I don't agree with this thinking, but they kind of thought, oh, you're trying to show off. You know what I mean? So you should just come anyway. So what happened is later, in the late 11th century, especially in the post-schism period, when they switched to unleavened bread, if the priest is going to reserve like 5 broken pieces of unleavened bread and dip them each into wine, and then he's going to later try to hand those pieces to somebody, they're not going to hold up together, if you know what I mean. So at that point, they began to simply just not intink the unleavened wafer pieces into the wine, and they just reserved them in the ciborium, and then they just began to give out communion of one kind. So
Now,
you see, so my point. Do you see how they can? You see how you can explain the later distorted practices by earlier practices? How they kind of evolved when they got rid of one thing, it kind of led to another thing. Do you see what I'm saying?
yeah. Now,
Okay.
what was the okay? That brings us.
Okay, and the other point was Orthodox Latin opposition to the Filioque.
Oh boy, that should be.
Well, again, I'm not sure how to answer this because he says those who actively opposed it, not just the lack of the addition, but an actual making of an issue. I would say that Pope John VIII, he opposed it.
Yeah,
we have in fact John VIII's agreement, a letter that now later Roman Catholics try to argue this was a fake letter, but I think it's. Who was the one Roman Catholic historian who wrote the book about the so-called Photianism? He was like a Dvorak. And he actually defended successfully the authenticity of John VIII's letter, and where John VIII was like, "I'm against the Filioque, I don't use it." But what he tried to say was that a lot of people were kind of ignorant, and they're not meaning to use it in a heretical sense.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to get.
And so Saint Photius basically accepted that. He wasn't accepting that was right, but because the hierarchy at the highest levels of the Roman Patriarchate were willing to cooperate and take, you know what I mean. As long as they're going to be on your side, you're willing to say, look, they've got their patriarchate, we have ours, we have the same faith. Let them handle their issue.
That's why I feel that the question is a bit of a trick question. Because in order for there to be active opposition, there has to be active promotion. And we don't have any evidence that it was actively promoted, but just quietly put in some manuscripts in some times for some services in some places. The problem is that there wasn't any unification there in terms of, opposition to the Filioque because it was creeping in. You had a pope.
Yeah, it'd be like if someone said to me, where was the active opposition to the scholastic view of the sacraments in 1790s Russia? I'm not sure if I could point out anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, and I can guarantee you, if you came up to any traditionalist Orthodox person and began to present the scholastic view of the sacraments, they say you're a heretic.
Yeah,
right?
Still no.
Yeah, exactly. But would you accuse, let's say, some Russian elder or some Russian bishops who were defending the faith in the 1790s, like the Metropolitans of Moscow, as being heretics because they held to the scholastic view? And the question is, no, I wouldn't call them a heretic. I'd say they were wrong, and they were wrong not because,
not through any fault of their own. It's just because they thought those were the best dialectical tools they could find.
And later, what's true is later in the 19th century, you did have a number of people beginning to wanting to back away from that view. I think Elder Macarius, or Elder, who was the famous Optina elder? Was it Macari, or there was another one? I can't remember. He wrote about this where he said that.
I think it was Macari.
Yeah, I think he was like in the 1870s, and he had this famous letter where he said that it seems that a lot of Russian bishops are firm on the scholastic view that the Roman Catholics have valid sacraments. All right, and he said he didn't agree with it. Now, it should be understood that they weren't teaching this in an ecumenistic sense, and this is where no one really understands the whole issue, and so they confuse everything. That the scholastic view was essentially kind of and I don't agree with it, and I don't like it, but it was a heavily more systematized view of St. Augustine's view. And St. Augustine's view was actually kind of a more systematized view of St. Optatus's view. So St. Augustine didn't invent it. And the view was that you could have valid sacraments that were grace-filled outside the church, but they did not profit anybody. Yeah, they would either damn you or they would do nothing. At best, you would have no benefit from them at all. Right?
But
because the concept was that it'd be like imagine if a heretic walked into an Orthodox church and pretended to be Orthodox and got in the communion line, and this could happen theoretically if the priest wasn't watchful, and he took communion. Now he'd receive. This is how they were thinking of it. They would say, "Well, he's receiving something that's not his property, and it's not helping him, but it's harming him."
Well, they also they took it to the next level, and they basically said, if a heretic is doing everything right, is it theoretically possible that the mystery comes down? Now, keep in mind that I've heard things like this. I mean, I remember there was a 9th century or 10th century case of a monk in Constantinople who, or it might have been a server, who, in bringing the gifts before the service started, began chanting the anaphora. And when he got to the altar, basically they were like, "We can't use this."
He began chanting the what?
He was chanting. He began chanting the anaphora because he liked how it sounded.
Oh, okay.
And so the point is that what happened was that it became a concern that it had already been consecrated, even though it was just this guy chanting, and that's it. The point now, I'm not saying in defense, I'm not saying that that's all you have to do is chant the anaphora and you can make the Eucharist. That's not true. But what I'm saying is that when they were dealing with theoretical questions. What of a perfectly good heretic in a perfectly good heretical church doing a perfectly good heretical service, even though everything's right, and they might be Arians? Is there grace being sent there? And the whole point is, outside the church, this would either, ultimately, as you pointed out earlier, Father, it comes down to one of two things. Ultimately, either nothing happened or something bad happened because that person is not in the church.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So if you're going to hold that view, that's not a very good view. That you're actually not helping you're not helping the people who you think you're holding that view about.
Right.
Because this is pretty terrible. And many actually, I think people like St. Augustine and others thought that, well, this explains the intransigence of certain schismatics and heretics because they're receiving sacraments and blasphemy.
Now, as a side note,
now we don't agree with that view, and in my synod, that's not our view. I mean, I'm not trying to. I'm explaining as a historical view, and this goes back to the question of Orthodox Latin opposition to the Filioque. You can find it, yes, in the case of Pope John VIII and his associates, but the question is, if it was being slowly put in, and people were ignorant, how do you kind of find opposition to it if people didn't really know
what was happening?
All right, that's. I think we're kind of missing it. It's like saying, where is the massive opposition in the Russian Orthodox Church in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 1800s to the scholastic view? In fact, if you look at what was called the encyclical, or the 1904-1905 encyclical of the Russian Holy Governing Synod, or Holy Synod, they actually teach the scholastic view of the sacraments in the reply to Joachim III. Now, the encyclical is very anti-ecumenical because Joachim III was trying to kind of tepidly say, well, maybe we should look about changing the calendar and getting in the ecumenical stuff. And the Russians were like, absolutely not. But in the encyclical, they teach that, well, we accept
Constantinople listened to Russia.
Yeah. And this was, and Joachim III really understood, he was one of the ones who was like a secret Freemason and everything. But he kind of, once he got this opposition from the Russian church, it meant it was going to go nowhere because the Tsar was in the Russian church were immensely powerful. The Tsar basically paid the bills for a lot of these Russian for a lot of these Eastern patriarchates. All right. So, but in this encyclical, they talked about how they said that supposedly the Nestorians, the Latins, and Monophysites have valid sacraments and et cetera, and apostolic succession, but they're not part of the church because they say that only the Orthodox Church is the ark of salvation. And anything done outside of it does not benefit for salvation. All right. So now what is true is beginning in that late 1890s and late 19th century and early 20th century, you began to see opposition to the scholastic view. For example, you had Archbishop Theophan of Poltava, who I think is a saint, at least a holy man. He was opposed to it. You had Metropolitan Anthony Karpovitsky, who was opposed to it. You had Metropolitan Sergius, Stragan, I can't remember the infamous Sergius. Yeah, he was opposed to it. But as Father Andrei Sarov, who is a Rocourt deacon, he wrote a kind of a master's thesis on this, which you can find somewhere online. Maybe I can find it and put it in the links. Where he says by 1917, 1918, when they had kind of that Russian, the old Russian council that's kind of famous, he says the vast majority of Russian Orthodox theologians, with exceptions, but the vast majority had essentially the kind of a heavily, kind of a, maybe you might say modified Augustinian view of the sacraments.
But that's the kind of with Florovsky's pseudomorphos of Russian theology.
Exactly. So they held Orthodox views, even though they had these kind of unorthodox currents that were going in there. But they weren't actively, but even these currents you could find some trace of in earlier history. You know what I mean? Orthodox history, because you go back to St. Augustine, that's part of Orthodox history, all right? So, so I don't know if I'm making myself clear about when we talk about Latin opposition. It's kind of very difficult to talk about that because you're not really talking about a unified body in the Latin West. I mean, even during the Ottonian period, I think things got much better. But and you had the Empress Theophanu, and that increased the connection with the Greek Church and such. But I don't know how well educated many of the clergy were. Now, there were various things they did try to do, I think, to kind of de-emphasize this. For example, it had been a common custom at Rome that you did not even use the creed at the Mass, that you went directly from the Gospel to the sermon and from the sermon to the offertory. So if you didn't use, in many of these places, if they were adopting the strict Roman practice of not even using the creed at the Mass, then it never became an issue,
Yeah.
So
what was the other question?
Okay, the other question is Orthodox proselytism or missionary activities between the 1054 schism and the 1700s. Okay, so what they're asking is, were there actual attempts by the Orthodox after the schism of 1054 and before the 1700s to convert people, and not just, I guess? Well, I think this is a two-part question. I think they're trying to convert Western people who went into schism and heresy with papism, and the other would be kind of converting other people, further east who were never even any type of heretic, whatever. I think first off, we have to realize that the Russian Church was continuously, as far as I understand, sending missionaries to Central Asia.
Yeah.
Until they got to Alaska, and that, in fact, by the time you get to the collapse of the Russian, even by the 1930s, you have these. Who was it? Metropolitan St. Kirill of Kazan was one of the new martyrs who died in like 38 or 37. He talks about in some of his surviving letters we have that he was like being sent to far Siberia, and he was meeting like kind of Mongolian pagans who never even heard of Christianity.
And that was back in 1685.
Well, not St. Kirill of Kazan. That's like 1930.
Yeah, that's 1930.
So my point is that you're talking about Russia. It's a massive area, and the Russian Empire controlled basically the whole territory of what would later be the Soviet Union. I mean, it's like 1/7 of the 1/8 of the landmass of the planet.
Yeah.
And that was a massive conversion operation. I mean, they were sending missionaries to Japan, but even before that, I have it somewhere posted where has a different the Metropolitan of Moscow in the 1500s. Maybe it was Saint Macarius of Moscow writing letters to missionaries that were going into Central Asia, saying about how to advise them to convert Muslims and to convert pagans. All right. So they were actively doing this in those areas. Now, in the case of the Middle Eastern patriarchs, in the Muslim-dominated period, I think there probably were conversions, and I seem to recall there were cases of Muslims becoming Orthodox. But generally, if that happened, you got killed if the government found out, unless there was like a tolerant Islamic ruler who didn't care. You know what I mean? Like if there was a Sunni ruler and then a Shiite person converted to Orthodoxy, they consider the Shiites not to be Muslims or to be heretics anyway, so they might not care, So you remember the case of the Holy Fire, where one of the Islamic kind of muezzin, where the term for the Islamic chanter, the guy who calls the Islamic call for prayer, he saw the Holy Fire come down, and he jumped down and from almost without breaking his legs from like the tower. And he proclaimed that Jesus Christ is the true God, and became converted on the spot. And then he was killed. But I'm trying to think. I think there were instances, but in terms of Middle Eastern patriarchs, pardon me.
One of the things we have to remember is that when you're talking about the period from the 1100s to the 1700s, you're talking about the Age of Empires, and so effectively, a lot of the missionary work was done under the aegis of whatever empire you were under. And so the point is that the Russians, being the largest Orthodox empire, you can find most of the missionary work being done there. Just as Gideon from the War Zone pointed out, because they continually worked in that region. You do find, Christianity continued to survive in the Middle East despite being constantly persecuted, but the point is, eventually you run out of landmass.
In the Middle East, you're basically at that point. Let's say in the year 1400 or 1500, if you're the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch, you're basically going to have in Syria you have to convert either Muslims, Jews, Monophysites, or Nestorians, or some other weird group. All right,
Druze.
The Druze, or something like that, or the Alawites, depending on what they are or whatever, So, I think conversions did happen. I'm not too I seem to recall reading things where people were converted, and they were certainly weren't into this modern 20th century ecumenical stuff with like, oh, we're all Christians, blah blah blah.
Yeah,
That's
it's
not,
all a new thing.
they were not into that. But and I'm trying to think now. As regards activity in the West, I think there may have been some in Italy, but
Well, once again,
I think in the Balkans, you probably you did have cases of the Orthodox missionaries trying to convert other Slavic peoples, but the problem is that you're running up into Roman Catholic countries where the state is going to oppose you at every turn.
That's exactly what I was.
Secondly, many of these people who are peasants, they're not necessarily going to understand, and this is unfortunate because they're not very educated. They're going to think that, well, what's the difference between us and the Orthodox, and then they're going to have the Franciscans or Jesuits or whatever come in later and say,
no difference.
Pardon me?
They'll come up and say, "Oh, there's no difference." So
and they're going to say these Orthodox are just inventing reasons not to be with the Pope. That's always been kind of the Roman Catholic, what the Roman Catholics accuse us of as being schismatics. Even though we hold different doctrines, this is what was so frustrating. We hold different doctrines, but they're like, oh, they're not really different doctrines.
Now, Gideon pointed out Russia also had a large mission in Poland.
Yes, that's true, but that's true because they control Poland. They conquered Poland.
Right, and then that led to the Crimean War.
Yes, I'm not, and he's right. And really, what we call the Polish Orthodox Church, if you look at it, is really made up of a lot of Belarusians and Ukrainians who got trapped into the country called Poland when Poland became independent. Now, remember, Poland was the Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth, and they kind of conquered areas. There was at one point the Lithuanian Grand Duchy was something like majority of it was Orthodox, even though I think one of the rulers apostatized in the 1300s and became Roman Catholic.
Yeah.
Such. And so a lot of times when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth formed, you had all these Orthodox kind of trapped behind the lines. And then, when Poland became independent again in the post-World War I era, they had all these areas in eastern Poland that were old Orthodox areas. And throughout the 1920s and 30s, like 1,000 Orthodox churches were destroyed by the Polish government. And this is why Stepan Skripnik and others who were Orthodox in the Polish parliament were trying to protest. It never really worked. I'm not disputing Gideon's point. He's correct about that. And I think people were converting and such, But however, one of the problems people encountered in the medieval and the early Renaissance period was that if a Polish person in 1650 became Orthodox, essentially you lost almost everything. You could not, I think you couldn't. If you were a nobleman, you could lose, I think, the right to participate in the government. If you were a layperson or a serf, if you were a Polish serf and you converted to Orthodoxy from Roman Catholicism, you might be beaten. You could be imprisoned. You'd have to basically flee and try to go into Ukraine or Russia, which meant you had, and to the Poles, or it meant you were becoming a Russian at that point. All right? It's just like, for example, what happened to all the Greek Muslims that the Ottomans kind of converted when they took over Greece. And there were like 60,000 of them or something by the time of the 1918 or 1919 left. Not many, but they basically became, when a Greek converted to Islam, he effectively took on all the attributes of the Turkish culture. And he kind of became a Turk for all intents and purposes, So I guess what people are trying to ask is, why weren't the Orthodox sending loads of missionaries into Germany and Hungary and Italy and France in the 13, 14, and 1500s and suffering, and hundreds of people suffering martyrdom to try to convert people from the papist heresy back into Orthodoxy? Because people kind of look at the early martyrs and say, well, that happened and people sacrificed for this. So why weren't they doing it in the in the late Middle Ages? And how do we answer that, Father?
I would say this. Well, first off, you have to realize that, again, we live in an age that's very unique in that we can see everything that's going on in the world with mass communication, so on and so forth. And what that didn't exist. At least I can even remember when that didn't exist before the internet. But the point is, people living without mass communication at that time, all they knew and all they grew up with was, this is the church that Jesus Christ established. Now, the point is, the Roman Catholics believed, of course, the Pope of Rome was the head of the church, so on and so forth. But the idea of someone coming up and saying, no, that's not the case. The church is actually a group of, patriarchates that are, divided throughout the world, so on and so forth, would have sounded like crazy talk to them. I mean, think about it. When you're dealing with, as I said, like a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon missionary, you have to kind of deal with crazy talk. And then what you're saying to them sounds like crazy talk. So take out the age of mass communication, so on and so forth, and it's just like some random guy saying the church isn't real. I mean, what do you say to that?
I mean, imagine a very devout Bulgarian or Serbian hieromonk with a lot of zeal being blessed to go into Bavaria in 1450. So he goes into Bavaria. He learns German before he does it, so he can speak Bavarian German or whatever dialect of German they were speaking then.
Right.
All right. And he says, "You're not the church. We are the church." And he begins to use all these arguments. Let's say he's very educated. Well, how is the average Bavarian Roman Catholic layman or assuming he's not going to be arrested?
You're not the church, and he's looking up and seeing the cathedrals around his house.
Yeah, and he's saying, "Look, we have all this stuff." He said, and he's going to say, "We Bavarians have been Christians since the time of Emperor so and so," and that's true. In fact, Bavaria was Orthodox back in the 3rd century. I mean, Bavaria is part of the Roman Empire originally, I believe. Right. And and so they're going to think we have this continuous line of these martyrs back in the 3rd century and all this other stuff. And then if the Bulgarian hieromonk or Serbian would say, well, that's true, but then later the Pope caused heresy and all this other, you're going to start getting involved in historical arguments. And how much is the peasant going to really understand all that, or is he going to think you're just a bunch of gobbledygook this crazy guy from Serbia is making up?
Well, now here's a counterpoint.
And secondly, even if he's talking to an educated person. How is he got to bring? He's got to in that Bavarian priest says, "Well, here's this book saying Saint." Then you get into the corrupted manuscript problem.
But even if we don't deal with that, what I'm saying is this: the last real teacher apologist before the modern era, and we respect him greatly. I respect him greatly, and I suggest everyone read his works. Is Julian Joseph Overbeck, who began the Western Rite missions. Now, think about this. This is 1865, 1866 when he's writing. So we're starting to enter the age of mass communication. What did they do to him? He was literally just like, well, we can do the old Western Rite in the Russian church. And literally the Anglican church in England, he was a foreigner. He was a German.
Well, remember, I think he had British citizenship by that time. He taught German at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, and I think he had some sort of tenure, so they couldn't. But he was still. In fact, they had a Lambeth conference meeting like in 1870. They condemned him. He was considered so much of a nuisance, and they complained.
They treated him like he was a threat to the Republic. The point is, he was like the enemy of the people.
Yes.
So
they did a lot of harassment to him, and and things like that.
And this is after the Enlightenment. This is after the printing press. This is after all these things that allowed mass dissemination of information. They still were able to completely destroy him.
And remember, and they did that partially. And remember, the Anglican Church and the British government were able to do that partially because they had a lot of pull in Constantinople and in Athens.
And
they basically complained to the Archbishop of Athens or Metropolitan of Athens, and then he complained to Constantinople, the Anglican, and they were like, we're not going to give any more money, because apparently they were giving money to them. And, we know how money works in these situations. And, and I think the Ecumenical Patriarch, I think in his defense, I think the Patriarch of Constantinople had in fact told Overbeck that he was sympathetic and he supported him, but he couldn't really do anything.
But that's exactly my point, is that somebody in 1870...
And that's not even violent persecution. That's just shutting someone down through other means and channels.
Right. And so the point is, in an age where communication was increasing and industrialization was increasing, that the last really great Orthodox apologist who was doing his work was treated as a massive threat by the institutional Church of England.
And remember, from when Overbeck was preaching in the 1870s, when he would try to convert Anglo-Catholics and say, look, you have to realize that your situation doesn't make any sense. The Anglo-Catholics, a lot of them said that, look, we have this big institution. We have all these people. What do you got? You just got a few people gathering in a house for kind of, chanting the breviary. Yeah. And they kind of mocked him for that. Because, they didn't have any priest, and There were various reasons for that because he had the whole situation about reception, and that gets into the whole scholastic question about that in the Russian church.
I think that here's the best answer that I think we can give, and it is that effectively,
Overbeck did convert people, though. He did.
He was
but he had to bring them actually to the chapel at the Russian embassy to get them chrismated, baptized.
Yeah.
Which then people were like, well, there's them. Then they were like, they're converting to a foreign church.
Right.
And then when they had native Englishmen become Greek Rite, Byzantine Rite priests, a lot of them left within like 2 years, and they always attacked Overbeck, these same priests who were converts, as being unstable when he was like the most stable person for this entire period. I'm sorry, I just had to bring that up.
No, and I understand, but my point is this: is that to answer the question, in our ecumenist milieu, it would seem to make perfect sense. Like, why didn't the Orthodox missionize these people? No, at that time, everyone believed they were the church. And so the missionary would be encountering much more opposition than they did. And even in 1870, Overbeck was encountering massive opposition. I can only imagine what it would be in the 15th century.
And remember, Overbeck was one of the most highly educated men of his age. He knew like 15 languages. He knew ancient Hebrew, ancient Coptic, ancient Armenian, Slavonic. He could deal with manuscripts, with text. So he was probably the most educated person to know Orthodox history, and even Roman Catholic and Protestant history. And look what they did, like you said, like they did to him. But like you say, what would happen to the opposition? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in there, but opposition.
I'm more than welcome. I'm reading what Gideon wrote here, and he wrote, regarding the lack of education in the pre-modern era, I've seen this used as an argument by Protestants. The idea is essentially that these arguments are too complex for the average person, especially in the pre-modern world where we couldn't easily search hundreds of historical documents, whereas in Protestantism all you can need is faith. How would you respond to this? I would say, honestly, and I'm going to respond to this because I personally am offended by it. The belief that we have been taught for ages now is that the Middle Ages, we can use the Middle Ages, not because the Renaissance is the point where humans apparently suddenly discovered they had brains, is that these people were all dumb and ignorant. No, that's not true. They were taught with presuppositions, a lot of presuppositions, but the point is they were still taught. You had polyglots back then. You had people who understood literally, 5-6 languages at a time, just like we celebrate it in the New York Times now. The point is that we are assuming too little of people when we say.
Well, we also got to remember, ignorant doesn't mean stupid. If you're a peasant in Bavaria, you're not going. It doesn't mean you're.
I'm going to posit that a peasant in Bavaria understands things better than your average Democratic Union worker in the United States.
Okay, sure, I agree.
A peasant understood his vacation time better. So yes. The point is that I would say that at least people understood their self-worth. They understood what they could do, and they were smarter than we are now.
But the question is, how would an Orthodox missionary in the late Middle Ages in Bavaria have proven to a Bavarian peasant community?
Right, but the Bavarian peasant would have already been indoctrinated by the idea that there was already the church and that
yes.
people were around it, and it was around him. And so the missionary would have to deal with that, and then would have to deal with the potential of police forces attacking him.
Yeah, it's like someone coming to the United States and saying the American government is not legitimate.
Right, but
how would you deal with that?
Well, if I'd say get out, but that's not the point. I'm just saying that in this particular case, what he's talking about, and he says the idea is that essentially these arguments are too complex for the average person. No, they're not too complex for the average person. That's just assuming that.
I think he's responding to what I said. What I said was that an educated Orthodox missionary who would go into Bavaria or Germany or whatever, any other places of it in the 1400s, if he knows a lot of material, he's going to try to explain. The Filioque, why the Filioque way is wrong, and why the other Roman Catholic doctrines are wrong, and why the Orthodox Church is the true church.
But he still has the central problem. The central problem is it says, whereas in Protestantism all you need is faith. No, you need faith in the Bible. Well, who put together the Bible? Nobody asked that question. We don't sit there going, we're not Mormons. We don't believe that like the Bible just ended out of the sky. When you start asking questions about the Bible itself, the answer comes out.
And remember, Protestantism could not have happened if there hadn't already been a culture that respected the scriptures as of immense, as divinely inspired.
Exactly. And so the point is, I would say that a Protestant who says these arguments are too complex for an average person is insulting you.
But just so I'm clear, I think Gideon is asking that that maybe he could rephrase it. I'm still not quite.
I think the problem that you're having is that he's saying, whereas in Protestantism all you need is faith, but that's not even true.
Yes. Well, again, I think even in what type of Protestantism we're talking about, because if you talk about, let's say, like, high scholastic Lutheranism or magisterial Presbyterianism or something like that, you're supposed to learn. You're supposed to. That exists, but that's actually a minor thing. Protestantism is getting dumber and dumber over the centuries, by the way.
Well, yeah, but the point is, it's dumber, and the media makes humans dumber and dumber too. And the point is, we have to be better than that. We have to be better than the system.
And we also don't want to. We'd also got to avoid this thing of when we debate, we'll try to talk to Protestants of just assuming they're stupid and idiots.
Right? Because we have to look, the best of them.
Where we're saying, why haven't you read these books, and why haven't you done this, and laughing at them, because that's not going to be well received.
No, I think what we need to do is we need to accept the experiences that are useful to them and begin to move forward with that. I think that the problem is that even Protestants now are aware of heresy. I thought it was, I saw a Joel Osteen meme that was kind of hilarious, where someone just put, "This is heretic," and the point is, it's very true, because in some ways the modern Protestant mentality is morphing. And what I mean by morphing is that I've seen two streams in Protestantism. I've seen the Ray Comfort sort of the way thing, where these guys are legitimately trying to figure out how to be real Christians. And those people you could reach to.
Let me make a point real quick.
Yeah.
I think it's actually become much harder to have any kind of debate with Protestants since the Great Awakening, like in the Second Great Awakening. Especially when you get to the Second Great Awakening in the 1820s, they come up with this idea that it begins to gradually form. You get to Charles Finney in America. You get to D.L. Moody. You get to C.H. Spurgeon. They gradually form this view that's called the sinner's prayer kind of conversion, born-again experience, where you have to say this sinner's prayer, mean you're repentant, and when you do this, you're the new birth, being born again happens. It doesn't happen in baptism. And what happens as a result is everybody who doesn't say that prayer, and I was raised with that, you don't consider to be Christian, and anything they say you're not going to take seriously. And that's how I was in fact taught, that everything they're saying, if they haven't said that prayer, you don't take seriously and just keep on hammering at. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
I do know what you're talking about.
Because before that, they did not believe that, and you could actually, there was actually this view that, that's not what constituted conversion,
Right.
But so that before, if a Lutheran or a Presbyterian or a Methodist in the 1700s had gone to an area of Indians to convert them, they would have explained what they thought was the gospel, say, do you accept this? And they say yes or no. And if they did say yes, then you'd explain more. Then you do do the baptism and things like that. And they well, now you're converted. Whereas a lot of the modern born again evangelical Protestants would say, oh, that's not really conversion. They're still not saved.
Yeah,
because they say they never had an emotional experience. They never got the Lord in their heart.
Which is exactly the same thing the Mormons argue. What I would say is this: if I met somebody, because we of course run into people, you need this sinner's prayer, and what you have to say is, okay, well that's good. You have a beginning. You are trying to establish a relationship with our Lord Jesus Christ. Now you need to be baptized, and you just that's it. I know it sounds simple, but the point is, if you're dealing with a simple quote-unquote theological system, you've got to respond simply. And the response is, if somebody says, well, all I need is faith to be saved, you say, that's great. I'm glad you have faith. We're not done yet.
All right. The third question. The history of the Uniates, Greek, Slavic, Maronite, Coptic, Syriac, Ethiopian, and how they are essentially, or are they essentially proto-ecumenists?
Oh, boy.
That's a massive topic, but
I want to tackle it.
Okay. First off, I like to address some of the stuff like the Ethiopian. Now, when people hear the word Uniate, they kind of immediately think of like, oh, Uniate only means like former Orthodox that become Roman Catholics but keep the Byzantine ritual. technically the word union means any group that joins the papacy and keeps its original liturgical customs. So the Syro-Jacobites, the Armenians, they didn't include them, the Ethiopians, etc. Now, I'd like to point out that this is a discussion I think we had, I don't know if you remember, like 2 years ago on a Facebook forum, where someone was trying to say that, the Western Rite Orthodox, you're just, there was Roman Catholics attacking us, and they were saying, you're not organic because look at all the unions that joined the papacy. They were organically part of bodies, and they kept their native liturgies. Well, in the case of things like some of the Syriac unions, I think the Syriac unions were started by some former Orthodox who became like a Maronite, and then he later they decided to like have him ordained as a missionary to Syrians.
Well, okay.
In the Ethiopian case, the Ethiopian Union kind of started in the 20th century, when the Latin Rite Italian bishop in Ethiopia was given permission to consecrate kind of an Ethiopian man, a bishop, and then he was supposed to adopt the Coptic Rite. So some of these they just kind of created out of whole air.
I'm gonna try to speak to my own experience.
Yeah.
Before I came to Orthodoxy, I was attending the Eastern Catholic churches for almost enough time where I could have applied to Rome to become a Byzantine Catholic, and God decided otherwise. The Eastern Catholic churches, in some ways, are kind of a mess. And what I mean by that is that if you take certain groups like the Ruffinians, who joined with the Union of Brest, Litvsk, or Uzhhorod. I forget which one was the Ukrainian one, which one was the Ruthenian.
Well, the one in the late 1590s was like 7 or 10 Ukrainian bishops,
right?
And Belarusian bishops too,
right? But the whole point is that when you say the Union, you're not talking about the same thing with everyone. Because with them, you saw a political union that actually had parishes, so on and so forth. And then you have things like the Russian Catholic Church, which was literally started by a few Jesuits who were sent by Rome to learn Russian, and so on.
It was done in the 1920s, the Russian Catholic Church, actually.
Right, that's what I'm talking about. But the whole point is that, and then we could talk about the Ethiopians, and we can talk about all these groups, but the point is you have to speak of each one in a different way because they were all formed in different ways. Some of which was closer to what would just be a simple union, and some of which was literally creation by Rome as some sort of fake system.
Now the Ruthenian, what's called the Ruthenian Greek Catholics,
right,
were in fact formed in 1646, what was called the Union of Uzhhorod,
right.
where 63 Ruthenian. Now this is like 50 years after Brest Litvsk, and the Union,
that's after the Ukrainians. Yeah, I know.
So that's kind of a different. And in fact, there was some document, there was some study that was written again. I think you could find like this Rokor history site, where there was a discussion in the Rokor Synod in the 1950s about how to receive unions. Should they change the policy?
Right.
And I think Archbishop Verki or one of the other bishops said something like, when the Union of Uzhhorod was proclaimed, a lot of people had no idea what had actually happened.
Right. No, that's true.
They actually thought they were still Orthodox, and they just,
they just went along their lives because.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not defending it. I'm just saying that, for an average person,
they just reached the commemoration of the Pope, and
they just thought, oh, the Pope's now Orthodox. I mean,
right.
that's stupid. But I mean, if you're some peasant living in the mountain community of the Ruthenian Mountains,
that's actually something that you saw though in the court documents when you're dealing with Saint Alexis Pope. When he was bringing back many of the unions to Orthodoxy, is that that a lot of the people were confused, and they said, "Well, I've always been Greek Catholic. I'm still Greek Catholic now." And the point is that they just realized that the Pope was bad, and so they were like, "Okay, we're going to leave the Pope." Now, granted, would I say that that's adequate catechesis? No, but were they Orthodox because they left the Pope and joined the Orthodox Church? Yeah, probably. It's not even a problem. They did, but they still had to deal with confession and all the mysteries and stuff. But the point I'm trying to make is that you can't. the Uniate missions, they don't even deserve to be called missions, except for the Melkites, where the Franciscans did a lot of work in trying to convert the synod. In most of these cases, there were political unions, and because of the nature of people, just like we were talking about with this missionary, the theoretical missionary to Bavaria, although he probably existed, is that a lot of these people just went along with what happened, and so.
Well, this same thing happened in Italy. The Greek monasteries in Rome went along with Leo IX in the Great Schism.
Yeah.
And you'd expect them not to do that. Like, oh, they have, like somehow the Byzantine Rite would have preserved, but it didn't. Because that was just where they were living, and they were, well, and you're right, they should not have, people should ultimately have respect for their bishop and their metropolitan and such. But that doesn't mean you have to go along with everything. And this is kind of how a lot of times it just happens in church history, unfortunately, that people do that.
It's funny, we started this episode talking about schism, and we're kind of still doing that.
Okay, but so that's we can continue talking about. I want to address the other now. The issue with the Maronites, that's a little bit more complicated,
yeah.
Because and the reason it's more complicated is technically they were
actually
the Maronites were in fact the members. The Maronites come from the when they had this during the Monophyite heresy and the Monoenergist heresy in the 600s,
it broke off.
The Patriarch of Antioch, Macarius, when he went to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, he was the only patriarch, as I recall, that refused to accept. He was like, "No, I'm a monophyte." He was defending monophilitism. He would not give it up, and so he kind of went back. And I'm not sure if they arrested him or they. I don't think they could have, because I think Antioch was in Islamic hands by that time, so he was allowed to go back. And I think he died, and then they had like this disputed election, and they elected an Orthodox patriarch. Well, the Antiochians who did not accept the Orthodox patriarch kind of were coalesced around the community, like kind of the Maronite community.
Monastery of St. Maron.
Yes, because originally that community had been, I think, subject in some sense to the Patriarch of Antioch, although they kind of claimed they had like some autonomous metropolitan, which may be true. Well, and so they kind of are like the Monophylite. Now they later tried to deny this when they joined Rome, and they're like the but we now know this has in fact actually happened. They were in fact the Monophilites that never accepted the Sixth Ecumenical Council, and in fact at one point some of them even rejected the Fifth Ecumenical Council. But anyway, they're very confused history. So what happens is
they're very confused right now.
I know. What happens is, I think in the 1200s or maybe the late 1100s, and you can look this up on Wikipedia, because I think they actually have good information on this actually. But you can look it up on other encyclopedias too. But they came into contact with the Crusaders because so I think it was Seleucia or Ctesiphon Seleucia. What's that one? There was a Maronite principality, I think, or something like that. Well, anyway, the Maronites and the Crusaders kind of work out this agreement, and they send people to Rome, and they're like, "Oh, well, we've always accepted the authority of the Pope," or something like that.
Yeah. And
then you have the formation of, at that point, a Maronite Uniate Church, because there still is a Maronite body that does not accept papacy. Well, it still maintains it. It's still, in fact, they ignore this, but they're still up into the 14th century. There still was a Maronite body that was officially Monophylite, that was separate from the Maronite Uniates. But by the 14th century, they kind of died out, and the Maronite Uniates ceased to be Uniates because technically there was
no one else left.
There was no one else they were Uniate from. All right, so that they're kind of, they oftentimes Maronites say, well, that we're not Uniates. Well, yeah, that's not true anymore, but originally that was not the case.
And they also...
Then they Latinized everything.
That's part of the reason why they don't... You talk to Maronites and they'll say, I'm not Uniate, I'm Maronite. Because they don't consider themselves Uniates in the traditional sense.
But my point is, they were originally... There were originally a competitor Monophylite church to the Maronite Uniates.
But
that kind of died out.
Is the point. And so they see themselves as different.
And now, as regards the Coptic Uniates, the Coptic Unia, I'm going from memory here again, that only started, as I recall, basically like in the 1870s. Yeah. And it was a few I'm not sure if there were even
Coptic. The Jacobites were right after Florence. As for the Ethiopians, that's like the 1800s.
Yeah, well, I think in the case of now someone can look up the Coptic Catholic Church on Wikipedia, but as I recall, I'm not even sure if they. I think they just basically convinced some Coptic laymen to join the Roman Catholic Church, and they kind of made them priests and things. I think that's what happened. Maybe they had a few Coptic priests join them.
It started in the 17th century.
Yeah. Okay. So that makes sense, because technically the guy who was the who discovered hieroglyphics was taught by a Coptic Uniate priest, and that was the 1820s or something, 1830s. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So I think they kind of started like that, and I guess they had a few priests join. But you got to remember, even by they were never more than a few thousand people at absolute most, and then by the 1890s, the Coptic Uniates were told that they had to use unleavened bread, and they also could no longer have a married priesthood.
Right.
Because that's always the fate of smaller Uniate bodies.
Yeah, smaller Uniate bodies basically can't do what they were doing.
Because basically at that point, the Jesuits or Dominicans or whoever is in charge of them is like, well, we're not going to convert a lot of these other guys, and if we do, we'll make an exemption for them, but you're too small to be treated fairly. We'll allow you to do certain things, but nothing else. So that's kind of what happened to them. The Slavic Uniates, that's the same as the Ruthenians and the Ukrainian Greek Catholics. The Greek Uniates. Now there were the Greek Uniates. I think what's that? Is it Cyprus? What's the one island that's got? Is it Malta? I'm not sure. Not Malta. Isn't there one? Rhodes has a lot of Greek Uniates on it, right? I think Rhodes does. Yeah. I think a lot of the Greek Uniate communities formed because of Venice, because Venice controlled a lot of these islands, and when Venice controls it, they're not going to be very friendly necessarily to Orthodoxy, or they're going to put a lot of pressure on you. Now, I think it was said, and this is again going off from memory here, and I'll try to find this and put it in a file under the details, that it was said that if not for Patriarch Dositheus of Jerusalem in the late 1600s, and for other people like him, most of the Levant would have by the 1680s have fallen to the Unia, and most of the Greek islands would have. Like, that's what the Synod of Jerusalem in 1672, it was not just about condemning Kirill Lucaris, it was about defending against
the inroads of the
because remember, the Jesuits and Dominicans and Franciscans, they made a lot of the Kirill Lucaris stuff. Like, oh, look how incompetent the Orthodox are. They got this Calvinist who was patriarch, and then they would say, well, they're condemning it now, but it's possible. It made the Orthodox look really bad.
Just to interrupt for a second, because Nick Trustclair asked your thoughts on apokatastasis. I'll answer it very simply. It is a pious thought and idea, but the Church Fathers don't generally support it. No.
Well, we should. Well, no, it's further than that. It's not. It's condemned. It's condemned as a heresy.
Condemned as a heresy, but we do accept that it is a pious idea. It's nice to want everyone to be saved, but
you're. I'm not. Let me jump in here. I think you're confusing it. Everybody wants everyone to be saved, but that's not what's going to happen.
That's not confused. That's exactly what I said.
Okay, all right. Well, okay. What I'm saying is that we do not accept apokatastasis.
We don't. It's a pious thought, but it's not an Orthodox belief.
Yes, it's not. You're not allowed to hold that view. And it doesn't matter whether you say, well, it's only human souls that are going to all be saved, as opposed to the devils or the demons and things like. It's just all condemned. And
that is ultimately the end thought of apokatastasis is that even the devil will be saved.
Yes, so we don't. And that was condemned at the Fifth Ecumenical Council and by subsequent decrees. So it's good to want everybody to be saved, but everybody will not be saved.
Sorry if I burst that bubble.
I mean, it's kind of like saying that. I mean, in a certain way, it's kind of like saying, we don't want people to be murdered or to be raped or to be killed. That's still going to there's still going to be murder and rape. It's not like we're saying, oh, you want it to happen. No, we don't. But we're trying to get the law enforcement and convince people, trying to preach to people not to do these things. But we have to understand these things are going to happen. That doesn't just mean we give up and say, well, no need trying to prosecute or prevent evil from happening.
Right. We still have to fight evil, but at the same time,
we still have to convert souls still.
Right. We still have to recognize evil will happen.
Now, I think another question is, were there people earlier before the Fifth Ecumenical Council that did teach what's called universalism? That's the kind of universalism is what we kind of call apokatastasis in the English-speaking world. And I think Now, there's a discussion about whether St. Gregory, the theologian, now that's another point. In one of the previous broadcasts, I said St. Gregory, I said St. Gregory of Nyssa was, St. Gregory Nyssa was the same as St. Gregory. I said St. Gregory of Nyssa was St. Gregory the theologian. That's incorrect. St. Gregory Nazianzen is St. Gregory the theologian. St. Gregory of Nyssa is not. All right, so I'm sorry. But St. Gregory of Nyssa, there's a lot of belief that he, in fact, taught apocatastasis. And there's a dispute about that because some people say those manuscripts are actually corrupted, interpolated manuscripts. That's what Patriarch St. Germanus said, I believe, in the 720s. However, some people, and now St. Mark of Ephesus, when this whole discussion was brought up about St. Augustine at the Council of Florence, he said that, assuming, now St. Mark of Ephesus was like, well, I thought that a lot of these manuscripts were probably interpolated of St. Gregory of Nyssa to make him teach apocatastasis. But he said even if they weren't interpolated, he's responding to it. Even if that's not the case, then it's just an error that this father made, and he did not make it in an obstinate way to attack the church. Right. Because one of the things that makes a heretic, one of the things is they kind of have this view that they know better than everybody else, and they're going to teach everybody, and they're not going to listen to any instruction from anybody. Like, for example, that's one of the things that made Origen condemned. People forget Origen was condemned in his own lifetime.
Yeah.
The Rome and Alexandria excommunicated him for not, because he chopped off his own genitals. We can go through a lot of stuff he was doing, and they talk about how he got tortured. Yeah, he got tortured by the Roman authorities, and that torture, as Saint Augustine said, it's not the torture that makes the martyr or the confessor; it's the cause. All right.
Very true.
So, so
I think that's exactly why I'm saying that. Saint Mark's thinking, he was trying to say it was a pious error.
Yes, exactly. So he had, and you can say the same thing, assuming we aren't dealing with interpolated manuscript about St. Augustine, because there's just as much evidence you can make for interpolation in Augustine as for Gregory of Nyssa. So people can make of that whatever they want. It just means these fathers were part of the church. There were some ideas floating around. Maybe they hadn't all been everything had been cleared away like it should be. And St. Gregory of Nyssa was a Cappadocian father, as I believe, correct?
Yeah.
And so he was having to combat the Arians at the same time. He was writing these other things when people were asking him questions about this stuff.
Yep.
All right. So it might have been a case in which people weren't going to bring up all this stuff in the midst of the Arian heresy. And then again, not everybody may have known about it. But like St. Photius says in the Mystagogy of the Holy Spirit, he says that, people bring up St. Ambrose or St. Augustine as teaching this or that. And he says, well, one, they're the minority of the fathers if they did teach it, assuming these aren't interpolated. Secondly, they weren't teaching this as an obstinate error in opposition to the teaching of the councils in the church, and they weren't ever confronted. And you know what I mean. They had to be confronted about these things. And Saint Photius says this is why we accept them as fathers. And Saint Augustine even says, and I think Saint Gregory of Nyssa would have agreed to the same. That if anything they're teaching is against the church, they willingly submit and they renounce that opinion, and that's what we should also. That's the view we should all hold. Yeah, we should never say, "Well, we know better." And that's one of the distinguishing features of all these great heretics, like Arius and others. They're all oftentimes very smart people, but they're, oftentimes you say you're too smart for your own good. It kind of means you think you know better than everybody else, and that's the problem with the heretics. Now, if it's all right, Father Joseph, since I'm not going to be here next week, if we could go a little bit longer.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's that. But let me finish up on the Uniate question real quick.
Sure.
So the Greek Uniates, they were some people who remain Uniates even remember for the first big group of Greek Uniates would have been what the people who was the Patriarch of Constantinople that accepted the Unia in the after Florence. And like his memory was effectively damned.
Joseph of
no, Joseph died during the council. I cannot remember his name. My point is that there were some who continued to maintain that union even after St. Gennadius Scholarius became patriarch and kind of had this official annulling of everything. All right, so that kind of continued. And remember, you had Isidore of Kiev,
right,
He was like and he kind of got driven out of Russia by the czars when they found out he had accepted the union.
Constantinople.
So I mean, the Greek unions, for some reason, it's never been really that big among the Greeks. They've never really been as susceptible to it. Part of that could be because the Ottomans actually ruled Greece. So unlike the Ukrainian unions and the Ruthenian unions, you didn't have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the whatever kind of breathing down their necks. I mean, the Ottomans just cared about they would kill people for being Christians every now and again, but they oftentimes just wanted money from the Orthodox.
Yep.
And as long as you paid the money, you wouldn't be necessarily nice living under them, but they wouldn't. I beg your pardon?
They wanted ridiculous amounts of money.
Yeah, and in fact, that's kind of how some of these issues with simony got even worse in the Greek church. Because if a bishop for a bishop to take his see, if after he was elected, he had to pay the Ottoman Sultan or the Ottoman Pasha or the local governor a large amount of money, which meant the bishop had to tax his clergy and the rest of the churches. And that created all kinds of problems. So that's kind of the uniate question. The Ethiopians they formed the same way as I think the Copts and the Syriac uniates.
Yeah, it was later.
I think there was like 100-year period though, like in the 1600s, or a large period in which the Portuguese had actually forced one of the converted one of the Ethiopian emperors or something like that, but then after an emperor and there was like a few emperors where they were actually in union with Rome, but then the emperor changed. And most of the Ethiopians had no idea. And now we don't accept the Ethiopians as Orthodox anyway, or the Copts or the Maronites or the others. But when Rome tried to engineer a union with the Ethiopian nation kind of joining as kind of a uniate church in the 1600s, it was kind of the same thing they did with a lot of the other groups. They kind of just said, well, as long as the emperor and his bishops... Well, in Ethiopia at the time, there was only one bishop. The Copts only allowed the Ethiopians to have one bishop, actually. So in Ethiopia, to try to convert the Ethiopians to a uniate or Roman Catholicism in the 1600s, it was actually easy because as long as you convert the emperor, he would just make he can just either expel the one Coptic bishop in the country, or they can just put a Latin bishop there and you got no choice.
Yeah.
But most people, when we say they're ignorant of what was going on, we don't mean they're stupid. You don't have all the facts. So if you don't have all the facts, it can be very difficult to make an informed decision about a lot of this stuff. Are there any other questions?
I didn't get any.
Okay. Are there any other? Let me see. What other topics can we discuss, Father?
Well, I mean, I think we've covered a few of them. A lot of them you can find on the Orthodox Apologetics War Room Warzone, where we continue discussing them.
What's this issue about the Quran and this man who read the Quran and became a Christian?
I watched that video. I watched it, and I'll give you the breakdown of it. It's a Protestant video, but basically it was this guy who was educated in madrasas and Islamic schools, and at one point he begins studying his Quran, and somebody asks him while he's trying to do one of his early teaching jobs, who is Jesus? And so he's like, I don't know. So he goes and checks the Quran, and he finds things like references to Jesus being the Word of God. And so what happens is he begins to look at it and start to realize that this Jesus prophet is way different than this Muhammad prophet. And so he begins to address that difference. And when he goes to his teacher beats him up. They throw him out of the school. He goes to his parents' house. His father almost kills him. And basically somehow he survives. He survives on, basically he proclaims, Christ's name before his father stabs him to death. And all of a sudden, he got some energy. His father fainted on his own knife and stuff. And then he just basically became a Protestant preacher, on surviving, basically on the name of Jesus with the confidence that he will die when God decides he's going.
So from an Orthodox perspective, how do we understand that? Because I inherently feel some sort of sympathy for the man that he's in in a Muslim country, and he doesn't know all he knows is that from his perspective, Jesus is the Son of God.
Well, I would say that I was watching this with a level of sympathy, and it's that level of sympathy we were talking about with a lot of these sinner's prayer Christians, except this guy actually experienced actual struggle. I mean, he could have been baptized in his own blood, but the point is that, he wasn't. And so I would see, him with sympathy, and we should recognize that, what he did for his faith in Christ was martyric, and now he needs to join the church.
Yes.
But, you know, if he hasn't, you know, he's thinking that's enough. He might be right if the Muslims actually kill him. You know what I mean?
Because I'm thinking of situations, you can imagine situations where, let's say in China or in some Islamic country, where somebody, all they get is, let's say, a Bible or a New Testament.
Right.
And then you read it, and they come to belief in Christ and the Trinity, and maybe and will God use that? Because obviously they're not talking to a Protestant preacher; they're just reading a translation in Arabic of the New Testament. And you know, this is just my opinion that, you know, God can still use that to save that person.
Absolutely.
That you know, because they're not actively entering into any kind of known heresy that they're, you know, I mean, maybe they might go into something accidentally, but all they know is that from reading the gospel, that who Christ says he is true, and they have faith in that.
Well, I think that
now the issue becomes different if the issue becomes different if things go much more awry, and that can't happen, obviously. You know,
right? But the point I'm trying to make is that in dealing with the chaos of Protestantism, especially with this case where this guy was
because I'm not convinced just because someone reads the Bible they're going to turn into a Protestant. That's not necessarily true.
No, it's not. And that's my point, is that his journey, from my perspective, is not done yet. He needs to meet the church, and we need to reach this man. We need to reach all of these people so that we can give them the opportunity to either, as dark as it sounds, become part of the church or choose to ignore it. And
now another question we had on the War Zone was someone says they have a friend that says she is Orthodox, but also says she rather believes there was no schism and does not truly understand the theology of St. Gregory Palamas. She has a PhD in history. What arguments can I present? So how do you deal with a PhD historian who says there was no schism and that she doesn't care or understand the theology of St. Gregory?
Okay. First off, she obviously doesn't understand the history of the church. She doesn't understand the history of Christianity. I saw that question and I thought, like, maybe he was looking for a date. I mean, I was like, you know,
there are people like that who have.
No, there are, but like, why are you talking to them? They're morons. It's not morons, but they're not. They have no understanding of Christianity, and they're pontificating on it. If you read
but you can. I'm sorry to jump in here, and I'm jumping in a lot, but I have read a lot of books by PhD historians, Cambridge, Oxford, and other places, and a lot of them, they may have degrees in medieval history and such, but they do not understand. You know, they think, oh, this dispute at Chalcedon or between the Orthodox and Roman Catholics is really a minutia. They don't really care about it. They think it's just.
I'm going to quote Archbishop Valerian Troitsky, which I was going to quote, a martyr of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And in his book, Christianity or the Church, he begins, usually people prefer to remain silent concerning a matter which they know nothing about and do not understand. This is, of course, completely sensible. Let us imagine, for example, a person who knows nothing about chemistry, but nevertheless constantly insists upon interfering in the affairs of chemists. He corrects their scientific formulae, which have been obtained with great difficulty, changing their order or replacing one with another. We would agree that such a person is acting with the highest degree of imprudence, and we can only have pity for him. There is one field, however, in which too many people consider themselves to be complete masters, in fact, almost legislators. That is the area concerning the Christian faith and the Church. In this field also, clear and definite formulae have been established with a great effort of theological thought, spiritual guidance, faith, and piety. These formulae are established and must be accepted on faith. Regardless of this fact, a great many people enter into the questions of faith in the Church solely as bold and decisive reformers who want to remake everything according to their own personal desires. In cases where such people have insufficient knowledge or understanding, they are especially averse to remaining silent. To the contrary, they begin not only to speak, but to shout. Such shouting on the questions of faith in the Church usually finds the columns of newspapers and ordinary conversations of people who in general very seldom think of faith in the Church at all. If they do think of such things, they prefer to voice themselves exclusively in an authoritative and accusatory tone, which is why my first thought is maybe he just wants to chat this lady up because she doesn't sound like someone who knows what she's talking about. And if she doesn't, regardless of a PhD, we've dealt with PhDs before who have no idea what they're talking about. That doesn't make you an authority on anything, especially the church. If she's a PhD in history, what kind of history?
I mean, if you got a PhD in German history, that doesn't make you an expert in church history.
No, it doesn't make you an expert in church history at all. And the point is, we don't even know was it political history? I mean, was it like, Marxian history? Was it the history of,
I mean, if you got a PhD in Marxist dialectical materialism, you got that's probably
it's worthless.
Exactly. I mean, you can't even use that in most Marxist countries.
Unless you have a minor in art studies.
Exactly. I mean, well, a PhD in dialectical materialism might be the same use as a doctorate in gender studies.
Probably the same. What's the critical theory?
Exactly. Okay, so your answer to him would be, assuming everything is that it's really an honest question, what would your answer be to such a person?
My answer would be, you need to learn more history, and if you are trying to talk up this lady, you can say, I can help you with that, and I will show you books on the history of the system.
Okay. All right, let's go through another question, another post. All right. This is another war zone post. In a recent article composed by Orthodox author Dr. George Demacopoulos, professor of theology at Fordham University, responds to those Eastern Orthodox clergy who are charging Constantinople with the heresy, quote-unquote, of papism. For Demacopoulos, to level such an accusation reveals a certain, quote-unquote, theological illiteracy within Eastern Orthodoxy. A more expanded citation below, quote, "Well, this is not the first time that the charge of papism has been leveled in an inter-Orthodox dispute. The uncritical consumption of this charge reveals both a broad theological illiteracy and the potency of anti-Catholic rhetorical smears within inter-Orthodox polemic. Even a cursory understanding of Orthodox Christian history or canon law reveals that there is nothing inherently heretical about the papacy.
There's something that Dr. George...
Let me finish. Many saints of the Byzantine era, including John Chrysostom and Theodore Studite, recognized the administrative seniority of the Bishop of Rome and appealed to the super-jurisdictional authority of the popes of their day. The fathers of the Fourth Ecumenical Council even affirmed the legendary connection between St. Peter and the papacy," end quote. And, of course, this question was posted by a Roman Catholic apologist, Eric Ibarra.
Well, yeah, but to be fair, I think Eric was actually asking a legitimate question.
No, I agree, but I think he was saying, this prominent...
First off, Dr. George is wrong. It's supra-jurisdictional, not super-jurisdictional. But that's beside the point. Dr. George Demacopoulos of Fordham is a typical, very liberal guy in the GOA. He is respected because of his degree, but he's notorious for using secondary sources. He's not...
He's a modernist and ecumenist. I mean,
He's a modernist and ecumenist, but I'm just talking about him as a scholar, and it's pretty... I mean, his stuff is pretty weak. I mean... What
has he written exactly, besides these horrible articles at Public Orthodoxy?
No, he did do a thesis on Rome, and it was weak. We could review it.
Didn't he do some kind of book called Thomas Aquinas from an Orthodox View or something like that?
I think that was him.
Let me look at that. Orthodox View. I think he did something. Yeah, was he the one who did Orthodox readings of Thomas Aquinas or something like that?
I can't say that I'm that big a fan of Demacopoulos to care, but
I know. Okay, I'll look it up later. Okay, but continue what you were saying, Father. I'm sorry.
The point is that George Demacopoulos is who they trot out. I don't want to include Sister Vasa in this, but they kind of do that too. They trot these people out as scholars in defense of the Patriarch of Constantinople. And the point is, these scholars are generally, I would say, they're master's, graduates who, frankly, have been reading a lot of secondary sources. They don't go into the fathers. They're not really interested in what the fathers are saying. They're more interested in historical niceties. And so ultimately, now in dealing with a real situation with real schism, I mean, he jumps to the old calendarists.
Oh, yes, that's the other quotation that you brought up.
Yeah.
He says, the expression heresy of papism was first employed by the old calendarist schismatics. There's that word schismatic being thrown around without any context or any usage.
But he's totally right. It's exactly the same thing, which is why Moscow is opening up a Pandora's box.
Yeah.
At this point, they're basically saying, okay, well, they're right on this, so we're going to go with it. You do that, and then we're going to start seeing things go in a very different direction in Orthodoxy. And I think George Demokopoulos, because of his belief in this institutional sort of thinking in terms of historical orthodoxy, thinks, oh, well, Russia's going to go into schism. Well, that's idiotic. I mean, Russia...
Well, because these are the type of people who are going to say that the Roman Catholic Church is not schismatic or heretical. But then the Moscow Patriarchate becomes schismatic because they don't like the fan art.
They're willing to excommunicate 2/3 of the Orthodox world. I mean, come on.
It's a very selective way of doing it.
And it's foolish, and no one's going to fall for it, which is why it's not going to reach anything outside the pages of, the National Herald or something, where some, guy will rip him up and to explain to him why he's wrong. And he won't listen because he's got an MA from Fordham, or a PhD, I don't know. The point is that, and again, it ties back into that whole Christianity or the church thing. It ties into the fact that, just because you have a degree in something doesn't mean you know it,
I know. That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
Nope. And so that's the point. It's a science. Theology is a science, and a lot of people who have graduate degrees are not scientists. And
even if you have a PhD in theology,
I'm
not still convinced that makes you a superior expert.
But most people who have a PhD in theology believe they're theologians. And any Orthodox will tell you that's not true because of how theology works.
They're thinking in terms of academic, quote-unquote, academic theologian. That's kind of what they...
Unfortunately, academic theologians mean nothing in the grand scheme of things.
Remember, we call Saint John the Apostle is sometimes called Saint John the Theologian.
And who issued his degree?
Exactly. He was trained directly by our Lord. But we have St. Gregory the Theologian, St. Gregory Nazianzen. So our answer to the whole Demokopoulos view would be what?
Would be that's a nice idea that he has, but he's wrong. And I think, unfortunately, he put it as a theoretical question, like, Russia will fall like the old calendarists to that degree. I think we'll just wait it out and see what happens.
Well, the old calendarists didn't fall, but...
Well, yeah, but the point is he's marginalized us. He's going to marginalize Russia. It's not going to work. You can marginalize the old calendarists, but marginalizing like a third or, almost half the church? Yeah, Good luck.
What he believes is half the church. There's another question here that was on the war zone, and I kind of answered that, but I like to talk about it. It's about the Council of Orange in 529.
Okay.
And Daniel Lerma asked, what is the position of the Orthodox Church on the canons of the Council of Orange, 529? Do they accurately reflect Orthodox belief? Well, first off, the council was an Orthodox council because it was held in the 520, I think St. Caesarius of Arles was the president of the council.
Right.
I think it maybe had. I think it maybe had 17 bishops there. That might be. It wasn't really that big.
It wasn't a big council.
It wasn't a really big council. But there was a question. A lot of questions revolve around one of the canons, and it's canon, not really. It's not really called. It's called a capitula, but they translate it as canon. And canon 13, and they give the EWTN translation, which I don't know where they got it from, but in the EWTN translation. Canon 13 says, concerning the restoration of free will, the freedom of will that was destroyed in the first man can be restored only by the grace of baptism. For what is lost can be returned only by the one who was able to give it. Hence, the truth itself declares, so if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. And as I pointed out, the Latin text actually does not say destroyed. It says infirmatum.
Right.
Which means infirm or weakened. All right. So it really says the free will was weakened by the fall, which we accept. And the word to have been, and the word that they translate as can be restored is reparare, which can be restored, but it can also mean repaired, renewed, or refreshed.
Right.
And in fact, the Council of Orange was kind of, the ending of the whole, so-called I don't think they called it, but people later historians called it the semi-Pelagian controversy. because everybody basically after the death of Julian of Eclanum, and then after the Council of Ephesus, Pelagian was defeated. And Julian of Eclanum, I think, maybe he died. I think he maybe died in the 430s. He was like the last of the major Pelagians, because people forget the Council of Ephesus, the Third Ecumenical Council, actually condemned Pelagianism. It called it Celestianism because that was the big proponent of it, but it was in fact condemned by Saint Cyril and others. And however, there were these old leftover unanswered questions about how does free will and grace operate together, and that was kind of discussed in Gaul for at least another 100 years, and so it was kind of settled at the Council of Orange, and the settlement has sometimes been called semi-Augustinianism by people, in which they didn't really accept what were believed to be the so-called, assuming they're true, they believed to be the extreme positions of St. Augustine. And, they accepted that there's free will, but also grace is necessary for salvation. But I was just pointing out there's a translation issue with those canons. And a lot of the semi-Pelagian stuff, that's stuff that later came as a designation for the 5th century Gallic fathers by the Renaissance, and I think maybe the Reformation period and such. So, for example, people will call St. John Cassian semi-Pelagian, even though St. John Cassian wrote books against Pelagius,
Yeah.
And anyway, so that's just to address that there, and of course another point to bring up, and we're going over time because I'm not going to be here next week.
I will still be here though.
Okay, yeah, I know.
We're gonna both survive.
No, I know you survived. And of course, there was this big.
I'll survive too, Father. God willing, you will.
Yes, I know, and of course we had some discussion with people bringing up. Now, from what you understand, because I don't interact with that many people, how have people received or understood the Hildebrandian schism argument that Hildebrand was behind everything?
I think it's a big silencer. I think that most people who hear it don't have a response, and they try, but it's usually because they're kind of hoping to base it on something, but in reality, it just shuts everything down. It makes it impossible to have the old-fashioned apologetical arguments where we can argue whether the Orthodox or the Catholics were right on this father. The point is, if the Roman Catholic Church was invented by Hildebrand, then ultimately the fathers are going to give their own testimony, and it becomes very clear. So I think that part of the reason why we haven't heard much on the whole who invented the Roman Catholic Church, one person asked me to write something, and I'm going to try. But the point is that it's kind of obvious, and I think that it disturbs people how obvious it is, and nobody noticed it.
Yes. Another question somebody asked is, was it correct to anathematize Origen 2 centuries after his death?
Sure.
Yes, absolutely. This was discussed on the War Room, and as I think we was being brought up is, again, Origen did not exactly die in the peace of the church. People kind of misunderstand this. He was excommunicated during his life. He was actually deposed from first. Well, remember, he actually got ordained as a priest in Palestine. And he wasn't that wasn't even supposed to be allowed because he was under some sort of censure by the Bishop of Alexandria, and so he did not die in the peace of the church. And now it's a different now, and he was in fact condemned for heresy during his own lifetime. So it wasn't. So I think people were trying to say, well, didn't Saint Gregory of Nyssa or Saint Augustine make mistakes, assuming those aren't interpolations? Yeah, but neither of them were excommunicated or deposed during their own lifetimes.
Father.
So they never made any kind of big argument, saying, "Oh, our teaching is superior to the church's teaching," or they never tried to make that point. And now some people try to bring up the point about Theodore of Mopsuestia, not Theodore of Cyrus, but Theodore of Mopsuestia, who I think died 429 or 428 or something like that. And he wasn't. He was also anathematized, and not just his writings, but his person, at the Fifth Ecumenical Council. But again, even the case with Theodore, Theodore of Mopsuestra did in fact begin to teach he was in fact the originator of Nestorianism. He did in fact begin to teach basically Nestorianism before Nestorius in the 420s. And there was a controversy in Syria where he began to say that Our Lady was not Theotokos. And it caused a big deal, and he kind of backed down, and the situation kind of quieted down. But we know he never personally renounced this, even if he, publicly didn't, kind of back down from saying everything. And remember, St. Cyril of Alexandria had considered condemning Theodore at the Third Ecumenical Council, but he realized that if he had done that, it would have prolonged the schism with John of Antioch.
Now, I received the question.
Okay.
And it was about the question of Orthodox missionary work in hostile lands.
Okay.
You take, for example, like if we look in Russia, if we look at what happened with the communists, and if you look in like Islamic countries, the question becomes, how do you deal with the idea of going into a land that is possibly very dangerous, but you have to preach the gospel?
Are you asking me how you do that?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to put that on.
Well, if you're going to go into an Arabic country, like a lot of Muslim countries, or Indonesia, which is also a big Muslim country, well, first off, you're going to need to know the language.
Okay.
You're going to have to study the culture. These are kind of, because obviously, if like I wanted to be a missionary in Saudi Arabia, assuming I could even get there, and I don't speak Arabic, so it would probably not end unless I decided to learn on the job.
Well, let's say you learned it.
Okay, so if I learned Arabic, and I'd have to also have much more of a knowledge about Islam to kind of answer things. And I went, how would I get there? Well, in a hostile country like Saudi Arabia, it probably would be much. What I'd probably do is, this is just my theory, I don't know if I would try to fly there, because they'd probably be watching me, because you got to get a visa and everything.
You fly there.
If I fly there, I get a visa and I go to Saudi Arabia, I'd have to say, why am I going? And if I tell them I'm going for missionary reasons, they're not going to let me in the country. So I'd have to omit it and say, well, I'm going to just visit the country, as a tourist, which, can be true, but you don't.
You get into Saudi Arabia.
Okay, you're going to have to overstay your visa. You're going to basically have to hide out and to not get discovered and not get reported to whatever the religious police are called there, the police of vice and morality or something like that, vice and virtue. And depends on how you want to do the missionary work. Do you want to go out straight, charging in and go into the public square and start preaching the gospel? If you do that, you're going to be arrested probably.
I think that's not the smartest way to do it.
Yeah, you could do that, and they might convert some people, but you're probably going to get arrested, I'd say, within 10 minutes. I think, or there's going to be some imam who's not going to wait for the police, and this is going to capture you and kill you.
Exactly.
That you're lucky if the police. I'm sorry, he used the word luck, but you're blessed if the Saudi police arrest you first. All right. I'd say you'd have to hide out. You'd have to find a sympathetic person. I'm not that. I'm just guessing here. The other option is you kind of sneak into the country and kind of hide out in the desert and talk to Bedouins. What would you say, Father? I'm kind of.
I would say that in Father's travels, which he's going into an area with a lot of Muslims. We're not going to specify which. And there is a concern for his safety, so we ask for prayers so that he will accomplish what he wants to accomplish soon and peacefully.
Yeah. But the question again is, how do you go into hostile areas that are not just ordinarily hostile, but extremely hostile? and the fathers did it. The missionaries did it, though. The apostles did it.
They did it without fear.
Yeah, and you have to be. And one of the important things, you have to be afraid. You have to be, and not to do it in a prideful sense, but you have to be say, look, I'm going to have to be willing to die. You have to be willing to suffer very badly, because sometimes in these areas, like a lot of these Muslim countries, when they begin to cut people's heads off, there's just been this big move to not use. I mean, if you see them cut somebody's head off with a scimitar or a falchion, a big sword, that can be relatively quick. But they've been using like little knives and all kinds of
hoping to make you break.
Because exactly. Because if they say here's a falchion, and if someone swings a falchion and they're really strong, they can take your head off with one lop. But if they take out a pocket knife and say they're going to cut your head off with a pocket knife or a steak knife, that actually seems much more scary than a falchion. All right? So you have to be willing to die. You have to be willing to endure a lot of persecution and torture and have a very, very painful death. And now I should say that should be what all Orthodox Christians should be willing to endure that. Now, we live in America or Canada, and
very comfortable.
We're very comfortable. We don't really have to. I mean, the kind of persecution we face, can be, there can be state discrimination and by the government, not allowing you to follow orthodoxy. And
deal with guys in pink leotards on video calling us horrible.
Yeah, and that's disgusting and horrible. But at this point, they've not gotten to the point where they're going to be cutting your heads off. Now, they might come to that, but
they would use lethal injection.
Yeah, they use lethal exactly. But I'd say first off, if you're going to a hostile area, you have to know the culture, you have to know the language, you have to know their religion, you have to know how to. You also have to, I would say, have some degree of extreme preparation for what's going to happen. And you have to be willing to say that everything I build, or if I am going, I might not. You have to be willing to say I might fail completely, and not convert anybody, and I may be killed almost immediately. And you have to push away from you any thoughts about, well, I'm going to be a martyr and all these. That's another thing of another pride temptation of the demons and the devil. Because if people kind of have this prideful concept, well, I'm going to be a martyr if I do this, I think if you have that idea, you're not going to be a martyr. You're going to break. So you have.
I'm going to disagree with you a little on that because of my own personal experience. And what I'm talking about is when I had Russian mobsters threatening me during the whole Luria period in Roac. You should not be thinking you're going to be a martyr when you're in a hostile territory. You should not, because it might not be hostile. But when it becomes hostile, that is your greatest motivation.
No. You misunderstand me. What I mean is that someone shouldn't be undertaking this mission for personal vainglory.
Right, exactly.
That's all I mean.
But if you
should be willing to be a martyr, though. You should be saying, "I'm going." Yes, exactly.
Well, because that's the thing. That is your greatest strength, and I have seen from experience that is your greatest strength when you are threatened with it. When people say, well, how about if we just kill you and your friends? That is the point where you say, bring it.
Yes, exactly. Because what was it? St. John Chrysostom had a famous sermon he preached where he said, no man can harm the man. Was it no one can. No, it was something like, you can't harm a man if he doesn't want to be harmed.
That's
and
correct.
what he meant is,
kill you until you let them.
And what he meant by that is that, yes, they can do physical harm to you, but they can never touch your soul unless you let them.
Exactly.
Fear not him, as the Lord said in the gospel, who can kill the body but cannot touch the soul. So, you'd have to be willing to endure all those things. And other thing is, you have to be willing to, any converts you make, you have to be willing in these hostile areas that it could be they could come and take those converts and put them before you and say, look, we're going to torture. We're not going to kill you, but we're going to torture these people to death. All right. Or that, and that's another way, because they may think, well, you may not care about your life, but do you care about their life?
It's very interesting because, this leads to a parallel of thoughts. And I'll say this. I remember during, many of the arguments I used to have on the Paradoxus list, on the Orthodox tradition list on Yahoo, and one person put up this Antiochian patriarch in the 18th century who basically was threatened with all the seminarians being killed, and so he basically like relented to what they were asking. So he said, "Well, we should celebrate because these many people were saved," and many people condemned what this guy was saying because of the fact that they pointed to the example of the mother in in the books of Maccabees,
Yeah, exactly.
who watched her sons be tortured, and she said, "You know, bring it." She said, "Do it, and I expect the best of you. Do not be weak. I
Mhm.
did not teach you to be weak. You will be strong."
And she said they have the hope of the future resurrection.
Exactly. And so the point is that if you have taught your people well, they have to be willing to die for Christ, because they have to. If they can be broken in front of you, then you have failed.
And remember also during the 300s, there was this immense persecution that began in the 330s, I think, in Persia by the Zoroastrian authorities against the Orthodox Church in Persia, and a lot of martyrs were made. And at one point, and I cannot remember his name, one of the Persian martyr bishops was brought before, I think, either the king of Persia, which is modern day Iran, or the one of the magistrates. And they had tortured a lot of the Orthodox and some of the, and both people who were raised Orthodox and converts, and they had made a lot of them apostatize under torture. And what happened is they told the bishop, "Look, you believe by your own confession of faith that if you apostatized, you're going to die and go to hell. So would you not rather they told the bishop, if you agree to renounce Christ and become a Zoroastrian, we'll let these people live. We'll exile them to like Iraq or something, and then they can later, be penitentied and go through the whole process of rejoining the church. But if you don't renounce Christ, we're going to kill them right now, and they're going to have no hope of salvation." All right, and he didn't. He did not renounce Christ because one, what they did, they could still repent even after they apostatized. All right.
Right.
They could still, even if they were gagged and they couldn't physically confess with their mouth, if they were still sincerely repentant, and they could still, Christ would still forgive them. All right. And secondly, yes, he did everything. And again, I'm not trying to disagree with you here, but to some extent, if they break, yes, maybe you should have done a better job, but ultimately, you cannot deny Christ because they deny Christ. That's
Right.
ultimately their decision. Ultimately, now, hopefully, you should have taught them better. At
But
some point,
I forget whether it was Patriarch Kirill the Sixth, etc. He was considered. It was one of the weak patriarchs.
but my point is, at some point, it's got to be more than just how much you teach them. They have to internalize and accept the grace of God.
Yep.
Because you can say all the words you want and you can show them all the example you want, but ultimately it's coming down to what is their decision going to be. And you find several of the saints, like Saint Ignatius of Antioch, he was being, or Saint Polycarp, some of the early apostolic fathers, they were like torturing them horribly, where they were exposing their veins and their nerves, and they were, and I hate to use the word ecstatic, but they were in this spiritual state where they were not. They should have felt immense pain because these were expert torturers, but they did not. Now, not everybody is that. You may go through now, remember what it says in the book of Acts, I recall, where I think St. Paul or St. Peter says, we must go through much tribulation to reach the kingdom of God. And remember what Christ says in the gospel, where he says, "He that endures to the end," and he was talking about persecution here, shall be saved. So, you cannot just endure a little bit. You have to endure to the very end.
Well, this is what I was saying about, my point of, I think it was Kirill the Sixth, I want to say that. It's in the Orthodox Church by Timothy Ware. But in any case, the point is when he was a weak patriarch, and they said, they were like, "We'll convert you to Islam before we kill you." And he said, "You're laboring in vain. The Christian patriarch shall remain a Christian."
And who was this again?
I think it was Kirill the Sixth.
And he was Patriarch of Antioch or Constantinople?
I believe it was Constantinople and
Oh, Patriarch Kirill VI. Yes, he was the one we quoted earlier about the unbaptized infants.
possibly. But the point is that the point is that ultimately we have to people killing us. We have to accept as a real possibility, which is why I liked watching that Protestant guy. He totally accepted death. He was like, eventually I'm going to die. And his thinking was, well, Christ is making a great mansion for me and stuff like that. Okay, maybe he might have misinterpreted the whole many mansions and so on and so forth. But his basic view was, if they haven't got me yet, then clearly there's a lot more work to do.
Yeah, St. John Chrysostom said, no one can harm the man who does not harm himself.
Yeah.
He says, for what harm did death itself inflict on Abel, although it was a violent and untimely death, perpetrated by a brother's hand? Is not this the reason why his praise is sounded throughout the whole world? Do you see how the discourse has demonstrated even more than it promised? Oh, I quoted out of. So,
indeed,
that's a big context. Another question. I think this is something we should. I think we should talk about. Does this group condemn Philotism? I'm sorry. This the whole Philotism question.
Really?
You don't want to talk about it?
I mean, I don't. I think we covered a lot of it, and we
did. Yes.
We can do an episode on. We can do an episode.
Yeah, that needs to be a whole episode. You're right.
When you come back, we'll do that episode. God willing, everything should be fine. And so,
yeah, I mean, everything will be all right. I mean, obviously, then there was someone bringing up about the tomb of Saint Joseph and the resurrection of Saint Joseph. No, we don't believe in any of that.
No,
Saint Joseph did die, but he was not resurrected. That's modern Brazilian visionary nuns or something like that.
We don't buy into any of that.
Yes. Oh, the other thing I wanted to bring up, we were going to mention from last that we actually should talk about before we go, was the question of Dostoevsky and socialism. You remember that?
I do. I still don't really buy into it, but okay.
Well, what they were asking, and I posted a few articles about this subject on the Warzone, and I did look through some of them. I didn't totally read all of them. I read one or two of them. What was happening was that Dostoevsky, when he was condemning socialism, he was condemning what was called French materialistic socialism. And what I mean by that is Dostoevsky wasn't condemning for example, if you look at the article here, it's interesting because some of the things Dostoevsky supported, like, for example, he supported degrees of state ownership of industry, a sort of a kind of a moderate welfare state. Dostoevsky also said in this article, I could never understand the notion that only 1/10 of people should attain higher development and the remaining 9/10 should serve only as means and material to that goal. He did support, kind of what we might think of as kind of interventionist economic policies and things. But my only point was that this does not make socialism.
No,
right? So, when he was against socialism, as far as I can understand, he was against the concept that the material well-being of man is ultimately all that matters, and it should be done, and that the state is all, and all the rest. All right.
Oh yeah, no, I agree completely.
So, oftentimes people, my only reason I bring that up is I think people misabuse some of the fathers and later Russian Orthodox writers when they condemn socialism to say, well, if you believe in Social Security, that's socialism, and therefore the church condemns you or something. It doesn't matter whether you think it's a good idea or not. That's not what it's talking about.
Any rich state is capable of taking care of its elders. You can even find that in the business.
Exactly. So my point is that someone can say, well, they don't like this idea of Social Security or whatever, but you cannot say someone it's a heresy if someone does support it. It doesn't make any sense.
No, I agree.
Now, especially when you talk about the Byzantine Empire and the fact that it basically owned several state industries, and it did have some sort of a welfare state on a very basic level and such. And were there any other issues from last week that anyone had asked me about that we had not addressed?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, and one more point.
Yeah.
Do we have any more developments about the whole Russia and Constantinople situation?
No, it's pretty much what we did put a video. If you look on the Orthodox Apologetics War Room War Zone, you'd put this video up where they're starting. The Russian media is starting to pick up on what is happening, and it is not pretty. Now, the one thing that I would bring up is that this is something that can be applied to true Orthodox. One of the things that was brought up was the fact that the UOCKP, the Kiev Patriarchate, physically forced clergy out of churches and then used state control to take them over. For us, this is a really old story. But the MP is going to have to reckon with its own behavior.
Do you think actually we're going to see people honestly saying, well, we've done similar things and maybe it was wrong for us to do it, or is that not going to happen?
Well, I think it won't happen if we stay silent. I think we need to be open and direct. I think we need to write these news organizations and say, why did this happen to the Roac Cathedral?
Suzdal.
Yeah. Why? You need to start saying, like, okay, we agree with you, but why did you do this to us? Or why did the state do this to us? Why are we not getting answers?
I mean, I have a bad feeling what's going to happen is they're going to say it's different with you guys.
And that's fine, but that's why I say talk to the media organizations, not to official organs of the Patriarchate, because they'll spot the hypocrisy.
Well, the question is, will Russian media honestly report on such a situation, or will they be afraid of displeasing?
I absolutely believe they will.
You don't think they'll be afraid of displeasing the Moscow Patriarchate?
No. Russian media is very skeptical, and you'd be very surprised. Even Putinite Russian media is extremely skeptical. They do not play games with that. They view the church with as much suspicion as they view the government, which is much suspicion as they view the Americans.
I mean, and this video, it said Russia 1 was the channel. Is Russia 1 a mainline Russian channel?
Yeah, it's a cable channel.
Okay, so this is not a channel controlled by the Moscow Patriarchate.
No, it's like headline news.
Okay, well, and it's interesting, the title, War Criminal Poroshenko bribes Pope adoring CIA asset while calling you to start religious war in Ukraine.
Believe it or not,
that's the most inflammatory title I've seen in a long time.
I'll tell you, no, in Russia, that's like every other day.
Really? They tried to pack as much stuff in there as possible.
Yeah, I'm telling you.
Anybody reading that knows what they're going to get watching the video.
That's why it's funny. People say like Fox News is like propaganda. I'm like, oh, you have not seen it.
It's very common in Russian media. I mean, you lived over.
And there's hundreds of newspapers, like hundreds, in the newsstand, so on and so forth, and each one blaring out an opinion. So
and Russians like to read newspaper.
It's a big thing. Yeah, and it was 10 years ago. I imagine it still is. Because now they just all have websites, so I'd say it's more decentralized than here in America.
So the idea that Putin controls all the press in Russia,
he wouldn't have time.
So he just ignores it, or he doesn't care.
He cares about big things that show up about him.
Well, let me ask you a question. Since let's just go for about 15 more minutes. What is your, since we said we do that, what is your opinion about Putin himself? Does he actually have any genuine religious beliefs, or do you think?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I know that in the beginning he probably didn't. I think that the whole the Maidan thing in 2010, like you pointed that out, with a lot of these the Russian religious scholars who are underground suddenly are like talking about that event. It might have shaken him. And he was just like, "Wait, what's going on?"
Now, have you ever heard his story of the fire that happened in his home in the late 90s?
Nope.
Well, the story is that he had this fire, and I'm trying to get, and he kind of barely escaped, and I think maybe he had one of his children with him or something, and he had some sort of that kind of scared him also, and he kind of describes that he kind of became a little bit more religious after that. He almost nearly died.
Surprised me. I mean, the point is, even though he is the president of the Russian Federation, in the divine sense, he's a simple person. He's not a God-anointed czar. He needs to be scared by simple things. He needs God to wake him up.
So, and what do we make of the accusation that, he was a former KGB agent, and once you're Cheka, you're always Cheka, you never change?
I don't disagree with that. But the question is, what is a Cheka? We're learning more and more that even some of these Cheka were, secret Christians. The point is, I'm not saying that that was the case with him, but the point is, being a Cheka doesn't necessarily mean that, he was like signed on to the atheist, positions of Marx, etc. He's a complex person. And I don't think that he's necessarily a good person, but maybe he's gotten better because of life experiences. We just don't know. But
so how does he view the patriarchate in Moscow? Does he view it in the sense of it's a Russian institution? It's useful.
No clue. The biggest persecutions of Roak occurred under Medvedev, who was he was like signed on to the MP.
And remember, Medvedev's wife, his former wife, her personal confessor, was the patriarch.
Right, exactly. So the point is, he went all out against the true Orthodox, and
so it seemed Putin just didn't really care about the whole issue, and it was
right. And I think that may be the case. Now he may care more, but I don't know that necessarily means he's married to patriarchal thinking.
So how was he look? Now when you lived in Russia, he was president in Russia, correct?
Yeah.
And how did people view him?
Was
he popular? Was he not popular? Did people not care?
I'd say he was popular because things weren't going badly.
Mm-hmm. It wasn't the 90s under Geiger and Yeltsin and all the rest.
Well, it's like, if I put it in an American perspective, like under Obama, things got worse for a lot of working class people. And the point is, they got worse under Bush in some ways, but not in more obvious ways. And the point is, under Putin, it didn't feel like things were getting worse. And so, I remember distinctly when I was teaching an English class, and there was this article, who is the most handsome person in your country? It was generic because it was written for Europe and so on and so forth. And at one point, people are naming celebrities, and at one point, some older lady, she says, well, what about Putin? And so, because there was this poll that was taken by some newspaper saying, is Putin the most handsome man in Russia? And the point is, most of the when she said it, the class started laughing at her, and they're like, that's the media, that's what they do, so on and so forth. And it was just assumed that, this particular poll must have been taken among Russian old ladies that was, that were very pro-Putin, because apparently, according to it, Putin was the most handsome man in Russia, which everyone else knew wasn't true.
Well, do you remember what I think it was not Yeltsin, but Solzhenitsyn said when Putin had been president for some time? He made this comment about I think the question was why was he supporting Putin, Solzhenitsyn? Because a lot of the liberal kind of neoliberal people in the West and the Russian establishment were like, well, Solzhenitsyn was supposed to be this big dissident. Why would he support Putin, who's supposedly a reactionary?
Well, I think
anyway, what Solzhenitsyn said was that under Yeltsin and the oligarchs and Geiger, who was this, and the old guys in the 90s, Russia was extremely corrupt and bad.
Right.
But under Putin, we're just ordinarily corrupt.
Well, that's my point, is that Putin was pretty non-threatening in terms of things. He made things work the way they were.
And he's not even an ultra-Russian nationalist. People kind of exaggerate in the West,
Putin is actually, in that sense, he's almost American. He promotes his own he promoted his own nationalist party to silence the other nationalists. So it was he created his own. I don't even like using the term right wing.
Well, United Russia is kind of like a centrist party of conglomeration of all kinds of people.
The reality is, United Russia, when I was there, was considered a rightist party, but it was a Putin-supported rightist party, so all the other rightists were bad people.
Mm-hmm. What do they mean? I mean, well, for example, I know in Russia they actually have. This is what's kind of interesting. In Russia, they actually have extremely strict laws against the whole hate speech stuff. You can't offend the feelings of religious believers.
Well, yeah.
But that's always been But the question is, what does that even mean? How do you define offending the feelings?
Well,
and they've never been able to really define it.
It's a protecting the Orthodox law. The whole point is, you can't make anti-Orthodox movies, even though really it's not usually used. Because even in that movie about this lady, the ballerina, it was just ignored. The point is,
The one about claiming, there was the one that claimed that Saint Nicholas the Tsar had committed fornication. There was something in the movie with this woman.
That wasn't actually the sin. The reason that the MP people were pissed off, and they had good reason to be, was because they made Anastasia, they made his wife, they made her out to be a villain, and she wasn't. There was no evidence for that. It just made her evil to make the ballerina look good. And so the point is, on that, yeah, they're actually right. But the question is, does that merit banning a movie? I don't know. I mean, I guess it does in Russia. So, but did it get banned? No, it became a top-grossing movie in Russia. So the point is, they worked controversy just like they do everywhere.
Well, this brings up the issue. Then, what should be the traditional Orthodox understanding in regards to, let's say, the current ruling authorities in Russia? Because on the one hand, we're not dealing with with the old pre-revolutionary God-anointed state.
It's like Greece.
But we're not dealing with the Soviet state, and
we have all those different synods in Russia, and they're all in disagreement. For once, the Moscow Patriarch is trying to do the right thing. I think it's really more along the lines of, whoever.
But the question is doing the right thing. We knew about the Metropolitan of Riga, for the MP Metropolitan, recently having this big meeting and ecumenical gathering with the Pope.
Riga is Latvia. We're talking about Russia here. So
yes, but I understand that. And then, Hilarion Alfeyev going to Fatima. So this is like speaking out of two sides of their mouth. So the question is, now that one doctor and professor who is now, what was his name? He was the one basically bringing up the ecumenism issue a whole bunch.
Right.
And like you said, is this a situation? Yeah, exactly. Is this a situation we're now looking at where maybe Patriarch Kirill and Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev have kind of brought this up for political reasons? They didn't like the Fanar, but now other things are coming in, and they may not be able to control what's going to happen.
Well, that's fine.
Oh, I'm saying, is that possibility? Is that a possibility?
No, I'm saying that's most logically the possibility.
Yes. Okay. All right. Well, I just think that's important. It's important to discuss. And we got about 7 minutes to go, Father.
We do?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess we're going all the way to 11. Wow, we've made a 3-hour show.
Yeah. Okay, so when no one's giving any more questions, I guess people are listening, or they're listening later.
We ask for prayers for Hiram Enoch as he goes into hostile territory. We pray that everything will work out well.
Yes, I'll be back in 3 weeks about.
I thought it was 2 weeks.
Let me see. No, you're right. So it's going to be about 17 days or so.
So, and we'll hear from him again. And I will continue running this. I will, I don't think I'll have a guest host unless somebody volunteers.
Yeah.
But in any case, basically we're going to keep on defending the Orthodox faith because that's what we do.
I mean, hopefully people have seemingly are sending in questions after the show because I guess they want us to answer them for the next program.
And we will keep sending the questions so we can fill up shows with questions. So the more questions we have, the better.
And now, what do you think? Okay, well, I guess we might as well end early. I mean, we went over time anyway. There's not much more to talk about. I mean, there's much more to talk about, but then we'd be talking for very much longer.
There's always more to talk about, but the point is, when it comes right down to it, this is about defending the Orthodox faith. And when you have questions, bring them up. Do not be afraid.
Well, wait a minute. There's one topic I think I did get some sort of question about some time ago, and I never really I never really asked it. I maybe have forgotten about it. And okay, so the question is, as I recall, the euthanasia question. All right. If somebody, now obviously the church's position is we do not believe in physician-assisted suicide.
Correct.
Okay. But I guess the question is, if someone's in immense pain and the doctors say, look, we can try this, we can give them, continue to give them high doses of morphine, but it will shorten their life. is that the same as suicide?
No,
Okay, and why would we say it's not the same?
because they're not intending to kill them.
So, in other words, the drugs the side effect may be shortening your life and you dying from it.
It lies against the drugs, but the point is that's more pain. So either way, you lose. But the point is they're not trying to kill you.
Now, are people allowed to refuse treatment? Is that considered suicide?
Absolutely. No, it's not considered suicide at all. It's normal.
So then how would we consider suicide in these medical? What would be the exact definition of suicide in these medical cases then?
When they ask the doctor to give them a dosage that will end their life.
Okay, so if somebody says that they don't want to, what I'm asking is this: since if somebody, like someone's mother or your grandmother, says, they're like 60 years old, they can live, but they say, look, I don't want any more surgeries, even though the surgery, has a 90% chance of succeeding and they're going to live for another 30 years.
So leaving the matter open to God.
So, okay. All right.
As hard as that sounds, it's important to realize that first off, that's not a guarantee. Even if they do the surgery, the person could be dead 10 minutes later.
I mean, for example, if someone says, I don't want an appendix surgery. I mean, that's such a minor thing, but you're going to die without it. Isn't that kind of overstepping the bounds, though?
No, well, not exactly. I mean, if it's, again, we're talking about a person at the end of their life versus a person who has a surgical procedure that could save them. It's one question, yes, this could save a person, but in almost most of these cases where we're talking about potential physician-assisted suicide, we're not talking about like there's one surgery that will give you 30 more years of life. That's not the case. We're talking about things like this will preserve you for 2 weeks.
Yes. So I guess the idea is it's really not worth it. It's up to the person in that case.
Well, it's up to the person as to whether it's worth it. And they may say it's worth it, and we should support that. But the point is we should support the person wanting to live as long as they want to live. But the point is, eventually, like when the doctor says this might help, but it probably won't, if a person says no, I mean, what are we going to say? Like, they're probably right.
All right. Okay. All right. Not much more to talk about. All right. Well, it's been good talking to you, Father. Hopefully I'll talk to you again in about 16, 17 days.
2 more weeks, Father. You'll be right back on.
I'll try to send you messages. Hopefully I'll have internet in some capacity, but I don't really know.
War Room and Warzone in the list. I will pass them on.
Also, thank you for formatting the books I sent you, and that was good. And so we've been able to get through with that. And okay, well, I guess this is Hiram McGeenick and signing off.
Okay, this is Deacon Joseph Swaden signing off also, and have a great night, everyone. God bless. Well, that's you, actually. I can't bless.
Lord bless. God bless you.